right, thank you, Joe. Yep, you too, bye now. So you weren't in the church?
Nope. Okay, everybody set? All right, we'll call the 7 p.m. public hearing to order. This is application 1340 and 1344 New Britain Avenue and 8 to 16 in Berkshire Road. We will start. So application by 47 Pratt Street, LLC, 1340 and 1344 New Britain Ave and 1816 Berkshire Road, requesting a change of the underlying zone for 1.7 acres at the northeast corner of the intersection of New Britain Avenue and Berkshire Road from R6 One-Family Resident District to RM2 Multifamily Resident District and Special Development District designation for a proposed 26-unit multifamily development in 3 buildings to be known as Berkshire West. Roll call, Ms. Pruitt. Sorry. Okay, who? Okay, I just read the application that there. I will make sure I speak into the mic. Roll call, Ms. Perini?
Is the mic working? Yeah?
Hello? Testing? Is mine?
It's picking up.
No. Yes?
It's picking
Okay.
up.
Okay, roll call? Thank you.
Mr. Barnes?
Present.
Ms. Cantor?
Here.
Mr. Davidoff?
Here.
Mr. Dodge?
Here.
Ms. Fay?
Here.
Ms. Kerrigan? Mr. Sweeney? Mr. Winograd? Mr. Williams?
Here.
Thank you. We are going to ask Mr. Allaire to summarize the hearing process to date because this is a bit unusual that we closed the public comment. We started this in July, and so if you can go through.
Sure. Good evening. As you will recall, on July 26th, you began this hearing, and initially anticipating that it might go long, you proposed that you would suspend the hearing at 10 p.m. that night. In fact, you went till 10:45, but at the point at which you decided to suspend for the evening, you had completed the sign-up sheet for public comment. The council had started to ask questions of the applicant, but it became apparent to everybody that you weren't going to be done anytime soon, and you had a regular agenda to reach just as you do tonight. So the hearing was continued for the purpose of allowing the council to ask questions of the applicant and for the applicant to provide its wrap-up, rebuttal, closing comments, whatever you want to call them. So the public comment portion of the hearing was closed. And I've reviewed the transcript. I brought a copy with me this evening to confirm that, yes, indeed, that was said at least twice during the course of that discussion. I think some people tonight asked whether there was a sign-up sheet, and the reason there isn't one is because of that. So that's point number one. That's where you are in the proceedings. Point number two, at the time the hearing was continued back in June, a petition had been submitted. My office had written a memo to the town clerk advising her that there were not enough signatures on the petition to trigger the supermajority vote requirement in our charter. Since that time, additional signatures have been submitted, and on August 16th, we wrote a memo to the town clerk advising her that that 25% threshold had been met. In response to that memo, which had maps attached showing how we did the calculations, but in response to that memo, Ms. Mancini, one of the opponents to this application, wrote a short note to the town clerk pointing out that I had missed 3 properties where one of the spouses who owned the property had signed on one petition and one had signed on another. Since we had already determined that the supermajority vote requirement had been met, it doesn't affect the outcome. That requirement is still met. However, in the interest of having a complete and accurate record, I asked Mr. Dumais to recalculate how the petition is calculated. And as you know from my prior memos, there are 2 different ways you can calculate the numbers, giving credit to all of the signatures. By one method, it's 37.37%. By the other method, it's 27.85%. Either way, it's over the 25% threshold. So I have updated copies just for the record for each of you so that we have a clear and accurate set of maps to go by. And that's where we are, unless you have any additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Allaire. I just also want to state for the record that we have been receiving, while we didn't take public, we're not taking more public comment here, we have been receiving emails that have been distributed to all counselors. So whenever we got one, we would, if it was just sent to us, I would send it back to the town clerk and it would go out to everybody. So everybody should have seen all of the emails that were sent. Okay. So with that, we will have the applicant come up, I guess, and if you're ready. And we can start with questions from the council. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll stay right here.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council, and also members of the audience. We thought it would be helpful again to provide a PowerPoint for you so that you could see exactly what the council is looking at as we provide a rebuttal to the comments that were received at the public hearing from primarily those in opposition to the application, and also comments that we received in questions from town council members. And if I didn't do it, I should introduce myself so that it's clearly on the record. Robin Pearson from the firm of Alter & Pearson LLC. Okay, you can sit over there. I need him close because I'm not good with the computer, but not so close that he's making me nervous. So what we have to talk to you about tonight is our rebuttal comments and also any summation that we would like you to leave with you as we consider this application, Berkshire West. I think I'd like to start with having Chuck Corsi come up. He has reviewed the transcript. I actually spent some time I went through all the transcript materials and compiled all the comments into basic categories. Our intent is not to go through every single comment that was made, but to rather address overall what appeared to be the major concerns by people with regard to this application. So that's what we hope to do so that you're going to be in a position to look favorably on this application. Chuck, you want to come on up and start?
Thank you, Robin. Good evening, Mayor Cantor, Leader Barnes, members of the council. My name is Chuck Corsi. I reside at 21 Walbridge Road in West Hartford, and I conducted the neighborhood and stakeholder outreach for this project. I'm not going to be brief. I'm going to allow Robin to go into some of the concerns that were raised from my outreach, but I did want to point out a couple of things. As you remember, I conducted extensive neighborhood outreach prior to the June 26 application hearing, reaching out to each property owner within 400 feet via phone several times. I visited the neighborhood, did lit drops, and you have my report from the 26th meeting that details that work. Since then, we wanted to reach out to some of our closest abutters to find if there was anything that we could do to address some of the concerns that they had. I know Mr. Baldy, Glenn Baldy is here tonight, and appreciate the time that he graciously gave Joe and I to meet several weeks ago. His concerns, and actually you have my updated report that was submitted to Mr. Dumais on Monday, and you can see the detail in that. His concerns, you can see them, dumpster location, buffer traffic, parking, smoking in proximity, would the residents be smoking in proximity of some of the abutting neighbors, and other concerns that he had voiced on back in June when we had spoken. Again, and I'm reluctant to speak for anyone, but he did reiterate that, and we tried to come to resolution with some of those concerns that he had. And again, Ms. Pearson will talk about some of those. He was very concerned about impact, what this proposal, if built, what impact it would have on his property values. And Mr. Calafiore even discussed the possibility that he would be open to discussing a property value guarantee of some sort, if that was something that would alleviate his concern. Whereas if Mr. Baldy would sell his property at a certain, after the project is built, and he sold it for less than he bought it for, assuming that the property was kept up, that Mr. Calafiore would make up the difference in that pricing. Glenn respectfully said that that really wasn't something that he wanted to pursue. Again, his concern, he would be more comfortable, and I know the public can't comment, but I don't see Glenn. Where is he? Oh, hey, am I, so far, is this accurate, what I'm stating? That he would, thank you, that he would be more comfortable if the project was owner-occupied instead of apartments. And that was a concern that we found expressed by many of the folks that I had met with. I also I did reach out to the Taylors at both 1344 and 1333 New Britain Avenue. They're immediate abutters on New Britain Avenue to the east of the property. I left phone calls, but had not received any phone calls back. Finally, there's one issue that I'd like to clarify that was included in some of the communications that you received. And Mr. Allaire, if you could help me out, I'm going to ask you to take one of these and pass them down. Do you have an extra Mr. Winograd for the town clerk? There you go. Mr. Allaire had referred to a letter that you received from a neighbor at 15 Shadow Lane, lengthy letter, and you've received other similar correspondence. As public records, obviously, we keep an eye on these to see if there are any concerns that are raised in these correspondence back to the council that, again, that we can address. But one thing that did jump out at me was under the heading there on the first page was ethical questions raised from the June meeting, where the letter writer writes that the developers team said they made a presentation to the Elmwood Business Association. They used Dr. Rick Liftig's name as president of the association and implied he and the members of the association supported the project. I wanted to clarify. Well, first of all, when I read that, I was very, obviously, very concerned. I have never and would never falsely represent anybody before this body. That's not that doesn't help any application, and it's not right, and it's not productive. So what I did first was to go back and look at the record to make sure that I hadn't inadvertently misrepresented myself. On the second page, you can find the written correspondence, a copy of the written correspondence, and there were several updates to it. The first page of my outreach report does talk about third-party groups that I had reached out to, and one was the Elmwood Business Association, where Mr. Calafiore and I made a presentation on the 6th of April. That bullet point is in every outreach report that I did for you. I think there were 4 different reports that were updated during the course of the process. At no time did I say that that group was supportive. And just to make sure, I went through the minutes of the public hearing and did an extensive search. The minutes do reflect that the conversation did come up. I believe, Ms. Fay, you had asked me a question about other third-party groups that I had reached out to that were beyond the neighborhood. And I have that highlighted, my comments in the minutes, where I stated, we talked to the Elmwood Business District, I'm sorry, Rick Liftig, and the Elmwood Business Association. We made a presentation to them. That is the end of any reference that I had to the Elmwood Business Association. I'm sorry to take up time on this, but again, I wanted to make sure that the record was clarified, and I appreciate your allowing me to do so. With that, I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Corsi. Any questions for Mr. Corsi? Okay.
Thank you.
I think the first thing I want to do is work off of the materials we provided to you with a transmittal to the town last night which just had rebuttal comments, and frankly, those are probably the ones we're going to concentrate on in our rebuttal presentation, except that we do have some additional information on traffic. And the first thing that was in that transmittal dated 9/11 is an analysis of one of the claims that has been made throughout this proceeding, or concerns or demands, if you will, on the town council, and that is that the people in this audience of the neighborhood who are concerned about this development deserve to be treated in exactly the same way and equally as those have been treated in other neighborhoods, particularly along Farmington Avenue. And there were a number of times that opponents have quoted, I believe it was the town manager and Mayor Slifka, in comments that were, I think they were just taken from newspaper articles without going back to the actual proceedings. But the gist of it was taking down a single-family house is not a good idea for multifamily development, and our neighborhoods need to be protected against encroachment, and that's why the council took the action that it took back in 2014. But what is clear when you go back, and I do remember when this happened, when you go back and read the transcript and understand exactly what the proceeding was, that was a zone change application put forth by the town of West Hartford in response to a situation where a developer had taken down a house as of right to put up a multifamily development, which involved developing properties that go in from Farmington Avenue on Bishop Road. And the neighborhood was extremely upset with that, understandably, and they called their council members and the town and said, you've got to stop this, you've got to do something about it. And when the town actually analyzed the situation, it realized that these properties that were now proposed for the multifamily development may have had, there were two single-family houses. One was on Bishop, and that was the one that was a particular concern. The other one fronted on Farmington Avenue and didn't seem to elicit the same ire as was generated with regard to the one on Bishop Road. But because even though it was zoned single-family, those lots, even though those lots had single-family homes on them, they were zoned for multifamily. And the town realized that indeed the developer, while the town might not have liked what was being proposed, was doing everything right, abiding by zoning, and the developer only had to go to the town planner and file a site plan application, and all the boards and commission in town could do nothing to stop it if it met the zoning regulations, which it did. So the town took a step, which was to rezone remaining properties in from Farmington Avenue, not those that fronted on Farmington Avenue, but in from Farmington Avenue, to straight single family. In some instances, it was R6, which is what we have here, and in some instances, R10, to make sure that any time this is going to happen in the future, an applicant has to come in, file an application with this body, get a zone change, and typically a special development district approval before being allowed to go forward. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that that's a protection that has to be in place to protect our neighborhoods, but it wasn't a prohibition against multifamily development. And when you read through the transcript, indeed, some members of the council said it's definitely not that. Mr. Dorr, for instance, who lived almost across the street, he was one in, he owned a house one in on Walbridge. And he said, for instance, I was very upset, Mr. Councilman Dorr, when the multifamily development came in along Farmington Avenue, in front of and adjacent to his property. You recall there was a church there that was converted to a multifamily development. And he said, I didn't like that, didn't want that, but you know what? It's worked out just fine. So I'm just going on the record to say that it's not all bad. And single family, including neighborhoods on Walbridge and a lot of those neighborhoods along Farmington Avenue, can certainly coexist with multifamily next to it, and he expressed satisfaction with the way it all turned out. So I just want to clarify that. The bottom line being, when they've asked for equality and to be treated equal, they are being treated equal because we have to come before you with this application so that Farmington Avenue properties in from Farmington Avenue now have to do exactly what this neighborhood has already experienced as being a requirement for anybody who wants to come in and develop multifamily. Has to come to you, has to make a case, has to be able to have factual information to support that it's a good idea, and if it's not a good idea, the town council will deny it. So that's the treatment, in effect, that they are asking for with regard to their position papers with you when they say, we want equal treatment. They already have it. We already have to go through this process, and that's why we're here. So I just want to put that on the record. There was a lot of concern that a rental complex will be bad for the neighborhood. I think the outreach report that has been submitted and updated as we've gone through this process has elicited comments from people saying rental is not good, ownership might be better as a multifamily, and certainly the last report that Mr. Corsi filed with you dated September 10th indicates that the real concern is that maybe condos would be okay, but certainly not rental development. I have included in that transmittal to you and would like to go to the next slide now. And if I just click on this. See, I knew I couldn't do it.
There we go.
Okay. So this is what I sent into the town council. These are, and for the audience, these are comments that we took out of the transcript that talked about these concerns. Neighbors said we need to preserve single-family neighborhoods against erosion by new multifamily development, which will undermine the community precisely as the above POCD warns happens without ownership. And that was a reference to one of the opening comments by the neighbors who are opposed to this, citing from the Plan of Conservation and Development, which talks about single-family ownership or single-family neighborhoods being the cornerstone of our communities in West Hartford. And we don't disagree with that. That is clearly what it is, what gives West Hartford, makes West Hartford, and should be protected. But the question is whether or not this development in any way is going to be the demise of this neighborhood or even have any real negative impacts on this neighborhood if it's approved. So they went on to say, our neighborhood already has a lot of multifamily residents, starting at east end of Shadow Lane to New Britain Avenue. We are doing more than our share. This will alter our quality of life so a developer can make a profit. And I point that one out also because obviously one of their arguments is multifamily doesn't belong in our neighborhood. It's out of character with our neighborhood. It would disrupt the single-family neighborhood. But at the same time, they're actually saying, well, okay, we already have a lot of single-family in our neighborhood. So they've asked for housing, build housing for families who will use Walcott Park and school, not housing for empty nesters and professionals who might like Shake Shack, which could go out of business any time. So again, an argument that single family is what we need at this location, not multifamily. We've absorbed our share of apartments and townhomes as part of our neighborhood. We understand that they're important, and that's a positive comment to the extent that they understand that diversity in housing options is important. Rental properties will not be maintained the way even a condo would. Someone who does not own just doesn't care about their property the way an owner-occupier does. I worked in eviction court for 40 years, and no renters are not the same as owners. We have way too many of these projects already in town. And finally, while we do have multifamily housing on the other end of Shadow Lane, it is owner-occupied, not apartments. This is not in the best interests of our neighborhood. So some did not distinguish between rental versus ownership multifamily, saying that anything other than single family would be inappropriate. But and a lot of people said that. I didn't put that up here, but a lot of people said, I don't care what kind of multifamily is, we don't want it. But we wanted to look at this idea of rental being bad, both to reiterate for town council the reasons why rental is good for West Hartford, but also hopefully to calm some of the concerns that people may have who haven't gone through and listened to some of the information that you have on other multifamily applications and understand what multifamily can actually be as a positive for West Hartford. And maybe that would make them feel better, rental multifamily. So I think it's fair to say that many of the ideas about renters being not desirable or bad people to have in a community, or rental development to be a negative on property values and all kinds of issues that get raised, I think it's fair to say that those really are outdated concerns. I've certainly heard them for years in many communities who are now encouraging multifamily development because they understand times have changed. The new multifamily rental units are extremely attractive to retaining people in a community and to enticing new people to the community. Today's renters, well, you've approved a number of developments in West Hartford for multifamily, abutting strong single-family neighborhoods on much quieter streets than New Britain Avenue, including 243 Steel Road, which is fresh in the minds of many of you, and you did that against the opposition of over 400 petitioners. And many nights of public hearing, and, a very difficult application process. But in the end, that development has proven to be very desirable. It filled up quickly. It supports business. It has enticed young professionals to West Hartford rather than to the affluent ring suburbs of Farmington, Avon, Glastonbury, and Simsbury. These are all communities, by the way, that are working to approve apartments to capture those individuals. And you heard from in that presentation Jeff Sager, who back in May of this year came before you to expand 243 Steel Road, even though there'd been significant opposition in the past. There was minimal. I don't even recall if there was any opposition. There might have been a few people who wrote in to say they didn't want it. But those 400 people disappeared. And they disappeared for a reason, because all of the concerns that were raised never came into effect. In particular, with regard to the desirability of rentals, I would just like to note for you, this came out of the public record, this is who rents in West Hartford in a new rental complex. And this is what he was able to submit back in May because he had information from his renters. And he found that, as he had anticipated, median income was very high. Median income for a one-bedroom, $118,000. For a two-bedroom, $172,714. Attractive median age was 32. He broke it down, it averaged to be about one person per bedroom. 23% of the people looking at these rental units and occupying them are empty nesters, people who don't have children anymore. He talked about the benefit for West Hartford because many of these were relocated from outside the community in Hartford County, and many came, from other states. All of that's positive when you talk about wanting to have a development in a community that has a diversity of housing so that it will attract young people and keep empty nesters in the area and in West Hartford here in the community. He talked about where they worked, and I've got those listed there. But there was some of the top employers, they're engineers, they're educators, they're in healthcare. And what you have not seen before until we provided this to you in our submittal is this is not unusual. This is a development by Marty Kenny, who is looking to build, at the time of this was in May of this year, he made a presentation in Wethersfield where he's looking to build new rental housing. And he is just in the process, I think he had just begun to finish at that point the tannery. The tannery is 250 units of new multifamily housing in Glastonbury. There was a process to get it approved. There is a neighborhood on one side of it, a residential neighborhood on one side of it, but he reports the exact same kind of demographics for his new rental building. He has occupancy, and it is occupied now. He was in the process of still building out. He had only had 230 units at that time occupied. He was still finishing out construction. But mean income, $122,000 per unit. The occupations, medical, 15%, professional, 19%, technology, 66 occupants. He talked about the age. His average age is 38. Mr. Sager reported 32. But I think he said that was after he took out the empty nesters. I'm not positive. But my point is, these are people that you want to have in your community. They're going to potentially stay. They're going to be introduced to a community. They're potentially going to buy homes when people leave their homes in the community. And they're going to get to know that community and like it. I expect these people are more likely they'll settle down in Glastonbury as opposed to West Hartford. But if there are more opportunities to reside in West Hartford, the chances are you're going to have more people who can buy these homes when people who are in older neighborhoods finally leave. And frankly, you heard a lot of people who are committed to this neighborhood who have been there for, we heard, 30, 40, 50 years. They raised their families. They're now in these single-family homes. For them, I think it's important to just make the point that having good rental housing is a positive for their potential sale of their units in the future. I think it's obvious when you look at that and when you talk to these developers. These are the developers, they know what's going on. Developers don't propose these if they think they're not going to be able to have them occupied quickly and as long as they provide a good development proposal. It's clear that people don't want to maintain homes anymore. Their maintenance costs, and many of them don't want to do it. It's a trend. It's a change. I shouldn't say it's a trend. I think it's a serious demographic change that's going on. When people finally decide to have children, and that leads me to my next slide, because this is not going to be filled with people who have children. And that was a concern people raised. Well, what's it going to do to our school system? We're going to need more teachers. We're going to need more classrooms. It's going to be a financial drain as opposed to a financial positive from tax revenues. That's simply not the case. People moving into these units don't have children. The slide on 243 told you out of 160 units, out of 160 units, there were 5 children in the school system. For the tannery in Glastonbury, at that point, there were 233 units occupied. There were 6 children. So that's not going to be an issue. I should go to that slide. That's this side. I'll tell you one thing that is interesting. People who live in these rental places have pets. And if you look at that, there's 78 pets there for the tannery. That's what they do instead of children at the moment. Now, when they have children, they may move out. But as you can see here, that again, he's got a split of mostly millennials and empty nesters. And that's what developers tell you is their market. That's what this applicant has said is its market. And that's who's going to be there. I point out the pets because I think one of the things that's going to make this development, if it's approved, attractive, is that you have a park across the street. And for young millennials or millennials who have those pets, that's a great asset. So school impacts I've talked about. I think right now I'd like to have, there were a number, the other big category was traffic. This is a dangerous intersection. Bus traffic is a problem. I can't get out. It's unsafe for pedestrians crossing the street. It's a real impediment, and even one more car is not going to be acceptable on this particular street. So you raised some questions, and we did a little more analysis to be able to respond to you. Recall and I'm going to ask Kevin Soley to come up and do that, but recall our presentation to you initially showed there is going to be no reduction in the level of service at the intersection of Berkshire and New Britain Avenue with the 26 units that are proposed. It's currently at A and B. That's a high functioning level for an intersection, and even with this, there's not going to be a change. So that is just not a valid argument against this application. But let me have Kevin come on up.
Thank you, Robin. Again, for the record, my name is Kevin Soley. I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of Connecticut with Soley Engineering. And we conducted the traffic analysis for this project. And as we went back over the transcripts and we went through all of our notes, we heard the comments and the concerns from not only the council, but also the public as well. So we wanted to make sure we could actually take a closer look at that. And just to rehash again, so what we're proposing 26 multifamily units. And as we identified in our previous submission, from a trip generation standpoint, this is a very minor traffic generator. And just to summarize that, in the morning PM peak period, we anticipate a total of 12 trips. That would be 3 coming into the facility, 9 leaving the facility during the AM peak period. And then during the afternoon peak period, it would be 10 trips entering, 5 trips leaving, for a total of 15 trips. So when you look at from a traffic impact, from a potential traffic analysis standpoint, this development does not generate a significant amount of trips, and our analysis, as Robin summarized, does indicate that this will maintain acceptable levels of service from an operating condition standpoint, both during the AM and PM peak periods. So those are the peak commuter periods that we went out, we did analysis for. A lot of the concerns and the comments that we heard was, well, our study didn't anticipate what happens during school dismissal. So what we did is we had to wait for school to start up again, but we actually went out there and we counted from 2 to 3 p.m. when Conard dismissed from school. So I do have some additional analysis which I'll submit to the council, and we did send this to the town engineer. And I'm just going to kind of run through those findings. But we went out and we counted this intersection, New Britain Avenue and Berkshire Road, to understand how it operates during that school dismissal period. We sat there from 2 to 3. We saw the school buses come in. We saw the school buses leave the site, come down Berkshire, and go on to New Britain Avenue. And what we found actually reinforced our initial conclusions that even during school dismissal period, the operations at this intersection are still at acceptable levels of service. During those peak periods, or during that peak period, what we did is we did counts. We observed how many trips were coming in and out. We then even applied our PM trip generation to that same period, which would be extremely conservative because those are the trips that would be realized during that rush hour commute, afternoon commute, when trips are coming in and on the roadway network. And just to summarize, so this was what we analyzed. This was our traffic operating conditions during our initial study, the AM and peak period. Again, you can see in the background condition it operates at a B and an A during the AM peak period, and it maintains a B and an A during the build period. And as I stated, we went out and we looked at it during that school dismissal. So we added that last column is how that intersection operates during that school dismissal period. And again, you can see in the background condition that operates at a level of service B. And even if we were to apply all of our trips to that intersection during that school dismissal period, which is a conservative analysis, it would still maintain that level of service B. The other thing we heard was a lot of concerns about extensive queues, vehicles waiting for buses to stop at that light, extending past the church driveway for continuously right up the road, and it prevented everything from happening. We observed that traffic come out of Conard. We saw those buses. What happened is those buses, they came in kind of 2 shifts. They would come to a cycle of the light. All those buses would leave, would go right through that cycle, through one cycle. Then there'd be another 5 or 6 buses, and those would also pass through. So we didn't observe any extensive queues, and our analysis reinforces that. And you can see here, here we go, hang on. So what we did is we provided a summary of the actual queues experienced by approach for those lanes. And you can see here, southbound on Berkshire Road, our proposed driveway is 250 feet from the intersection with New Britain Avenue. During the AM, PM, and school dismissal periods, even in our build condition, we're only 142 at our peak, which is well before that driveway for our project. So even during these operations, those queues would only somewhere in here, and that's kind of an existing condition, which we're not exacerbating in any way. And even during that school dismissal period, we've been able to demonstrate and provide additional analysis with additional count data that supports that even during that peak period where there was a fundamental concern, we still believe that this will maintain acceptable levels of service. It'll maintain, it will not have an adverse impact on traffic. And even during that school dismissal period, it can still accommodate the traffic coming in and out of this intersection. One of the other concerns that we talked about was accidents, and that this area of New Britain Avenue is very congested. There are a lot of accidents. There were claims that there are accidents, multiple times a day. What we did is we included, and we testified at the last hearing, we did do an accident analysis for this intersection, and we observed a total of 15 accidents over a past 3-year period. There were some questions by the council of, well, how does that compare to other intersections? So we could have a comparison. Is that a lot? Is that a little? So what we did is we looked at a couple other intersections in close proximity. So we looked at South Main Street and New Britain Avenue. There was 21 accidents at that intersection over the same 3-year period. We also looked further south at the 84 ramps. There were 16 accidents at that location over that same 3-year period. And again, our intersection with New Britain Avenue and Berkshire is about 15. So just to kind of see some comparative numbers of what type of accident analysis we have, this is the 15 at this intersection is not a big number. It's not a highly susceptible intersection for accidents. And just to offer comparison, again, you can see 21 up at South Main Street and New Britain Avenue, and there's a little bit more congestion up there. But the fact that our accidents is comparable to that or actually less, it just kind of goes to show that this is from a safety standpoint. We don't see any impact from this from a safety standpoint. It's generally a safe intersection from a safety operations standpoint. When you look at how other intersections operate, and a lot of these, again, the trends for the accidents here were rear ends, a lot of wet conditions, it's driver awareness. It wasn't a safety concern from a safety standpoint that we observed. And so that essentially summarizes our additional efforts to try to offer the council some additional analysis to help you with your decision-making process. But again, we wanted to make sure we looked at that period during school dismissal. There's a lot of concern about that, so we went out, we did that analysis, and then also offering a comparison for the accident analysis, which again, we feel that from a safety standpoint, this intersection is adequately designed and can accommodate the additional traffic without any adverse impact to the roadway network. So with that, I'm going to ask Robin to come back up and finish the rest of her rebuttal presentation.
All right, one of the other big concerns expressed by many people in the room at our last session was it's zoned single family. We want it to be single family. Don't let it be developed for anything else. It was approved for 7 lots. We didn't oppose that, and we didn't oppose it for a reason. This only benefits the developer and not us. One of the council members also asked why the 7-lot subdivision cannot instead be built out. It's approved. And I understand that this is an argument that could sway you, because there is an approval that was fairly recently granted for that subdivision for 7 lots. I think we've been able to put into the record a lot of reasons as to why that is not the best use for this piece of property. But more importantly, it has become clear as we've done a little more analysis and looked into it in response to your comments that it can't be developed, or it is unrealistic to think it will ever be developed in accord with that 7-lot subdivision plan. And the reason is that it's not economically feasible. Both infrastructure costs and the fact that the lots are along New Britain Avenue bring into question its marketability and make it unreasonable to develop as single-family homes. Now, people may say, well, that's nonsense, and somebody wanted to do it, and somebody can do it, but you know what? We're not developers. We aren't the ones that pencil these things out. I think many of you would be surprised at how expensive it is to develop in West Hartford. I followed up with Reinhard von Hollander, who was the individual who pursued that subdivision approval and got the subdivision approved for this location, and chatted with him about why he didn't go forward with it, because he didn't, and I had just assumed he couldn't get financing. Maybe ultimately it would have gotten to that, but more specifically, he gave me some more information about it. He said he got the subdivision approval, he invested over $60,000 in costs for engineering and permitting, but he had to walk away. He said, I could not make the numbers work as single family. By the time we got done with the final design for MDC sewer extension, we had to get out. Now, that was something that, those costs got penciled in afterwards. And maybe I should turn to the subdivision. This is the subdivision plan. And I think it shows you that, no, I guess it doesn't, but he would have to bring that sewer line all the way up Berkshire Avenue through those Berkshire Road against those lots to be able to provide sewer service for those lots. So he said he couldn't make them work as single family. By the time we got done with the final design for MDC sewer extension, we had to get out. And it wasn't because he said MDC was being unreasonable, it was not. It just turned out that the infrastructure costs are too much to develop single family there, given the installation requirements. He said, I would not even have been able to get close to getting $500,000 a house, which is what I would have needed to make it work once all the engineering, design, and permitting was in. There's too much traffic on New Britain Avenue and too many small homes butting up against this site and behind it to be able to make it marketable for homes at that price. I mean, so again, this is not me speaking. This is a developer who looked at it, who put a lot of time and energy and money into trying to develop it for single family, and he walked. And there's a reason that he walked. And there was a reason that it hadn't been developed before. Well, that's not true. Eleanor had the house for a long time, so it's not fair to say that other people looked at it and walked away. But it has to work. I mean, people aren't going to do it if it doesn't work. So he said, once we got through with the MDC, we thought about going back in for multifamily, but knew we would need to go through the SDD permitting process, which requires way too much upfront money. We were already in the hole for $60,000 for subdivision permitting and engineering, and we walked. I did have a right of first refusal to keep going after. 47 Pratt Street put its offer in, but we declined to take the property at that point, even after there was another offer in, because we knew we couldn't make it work. So I'm just putting that out there, take it or leave it. He's not here to testify in front of you. I can just tell you that that's what he told me. I know my client doesn't believe he could have made it work under those circumstances either, and that's why he's here for multifamily, looking to do multifamily there. But that aside, we think multifamily makes sense for this site, that this is a good development, that it's attractive and it's appropriate for this application. And indeed, other boards, and I'll get to that momentarily, who've looked at this feel the same way. So you heard from my client, Joe Calafori, who said he is a West Hartford resident. He's raised his children in West Hartford. Indeed, his family's here tonight. And he would like the opportunity to invest in this community at this location, and he feels it's the right development for this location. He will be a good neighbor. He's committed to being a good neighbor. He lives in the community, and he will always be available if anybody has any issues. As Mr. Corsi alluded to, he has committed to Mr. Baldy, should he wish to be sure, that Mr. Baldy will not lose money because Berkshire West is located next to him, and he would pay the difference in, a subsequent sale of his property if for any reason, which he does not in any way think would happen, that property values would go down as a result of this new development at this particular location. I'd like to just remind you, I think we spoke about it before, but we did do other things to address the concerns of that abutter on Berkshire. No, I'm not sure. Am I going to the next one? Wait a minute, let's see what's next. Okay, yeah, do it there. Go to that. So, Mr. Baldy's property, of course, is at the far end, right next to those trees along the boundary there of the property. The applicant did meet with Mr. Baldy. He expressed his concern about property values. I explained the commitment that Mr. Calafiore has made to Mr. Baldy. When Mr. Baldy told us that he was concerned about residents smoking in the parking area, Mr. Calafiore stated that he would be sure to include a prohibition against that in the lease, either smoking inside or outside on the premises, so that it's not going to be a problem for anybody next door having to deal with that. And of course, that's sort of a self-policing situation anyway, because most people moving into complexes like this don't like to have someone next door smoking either. So it's just, I don't think that's something he need worry about. He didn't like the dumpster location near his home. In response, we moved the location of the dumpster away from his home. And he was concerned about residents looking into his backyard. And in response, we increased the density of the buffer and included a solid fence along his property line in the parking areas. He has expressed concern about traffic, and I hope that the additional traffic information we have given you would be helpful for him. With this analysis of the buses, it would appear, based on what we observed, that his driveway is not blocked, and there should be no reason to think that this development would cause those buses, even though they do get through one cycle, but cause those buses to block his driveway either. So no reduction in level of service, so he really shouldn't experience any change as a result of this on Berkshire. So to get to a summation of our arguments, I mentioned to you before the POCD rightly talks about single-family neighborhoods being the cornerstone of the health and vitality, the health anyway, and then what's great about West Hartford. Certainly, we feel that this at this location will not be a deterrent to that. So when you look at this application, you're going to have to decide whether it's appropriate by looking at all of the characteristics of this development and what impact they might have on a single-family development. I think that the qualitative review standards you will be applying in deciding this application support it. First of all, the POCD says that you want to provide diversity of housing options for everyone in the community. 2 people, by the way, did testify in favor of this application, much to our surprise. One was an older woman who lived in the Chatfield neighborhood across the street, who said that she might like to reside there when she sold her home. And the other, also, I believe it was across in that neighborhood, a millennial who lived there, said he'd lived there for 8 years, and he thought this was a good idea for West Hartford. So you know that multifamily rental housing is in great demand in West Hartford. I've talked to you about 243 Steel. You know 24 North Main is full. There's a waiting list for apartments in Blueback. You're going to be considering a development potentially in the near future for a tech park incubator business type environment on the Yukon site. And it's fair to say that if that's approved, don't know if it will be or not, but there will be a real need for housing for employees of such an enterprise, if approved, and that those millennials working in town are the very millennials that you would want to have also living in town. So they have to have a place to live. So it's actually forward thinking in the light of something's going to happen on that campus, and maybe it's a good idea to have some more high-quality rental housing in the neighborhood. We think the location for this is good. It's easy on and off the highway. There's a park across the street, as I mentioned, that's going to be attractive to renters for their pets. It's close to all of the commercial attractions that are Corbin's Corner and the mall. It's a good neighborhood for this type of use. So as far as the characteristics, we think it's not too big, it's not too dense, it's not unattractive. In fact, when I read through that whole transcript, I looked to see, did we need the architect here? Were there issues with what it looks like or the landscaping? The answer is no. Even there were two people who said specifically that it's quite attractive, but not at this particular location. So I'd like to just direct you now to something that you might otherwise not have been aware of, which is that the other board that looked at this is the Town Plan and Zoning Commission. And I submitted to you my own email notes on what I had observed when I sat through the last meeting of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission that looked at this proposal before making its recommendation to you, which was unanimously positive. You have a letter from them that says it's a positive recommendation, but you don't know anything more about what they looked at when they made that decision. And it was very interesting. I was frankly somewhat surprised that they were as effusive as they were about this application. I provide my notes only because I couldn't give you a transcript, because the recordings for that meeting and the prior meeting are not available. They've disappeared. There's a computer glitch and they're not available. But I hope you'll accept the fact, and it was corroborated by Kathy Doro at town staff, that my notes accurately reflect that meeting and what people said. As you'll note, it's dated the day after. My email transmittal is dated the day after the meeting. So what I put in there was what I wanted our team to know about what TP&Z had to say about it. And that application, and members of the audience, many of them were there at that meeting. They had, there were a lot of them. No, they couldn't speak. They did speak in a way because there were signs that they held up that said, vote no. They did shout out information to the TP&Z from the audience. They couldn't speak and we couldn't speak because the Town Plan and Zoning Commission does not take testimony from either the applicant nor the public when it considers its recommendation to you. So they weren't treated any differently than we were. In fact, I was the only one at the meeting. The rest of my team wasn't there because we can't do anything. What happens at those meetings, town staff makes a report about the merits or demerits of a particular application. And at this particular meeting, it was the second one TP&Z had on it, and that in and of itself is unusual because they don't usually deliberate over 2 nights of meeting. But at the first meeting, the month before, they had asked town staff to really do an analysis as to how this proposed development compared in density to that single-family development plan that you saw. And frankly, I think they thought it would be not a favorable analysis. It was requested by Ms. Gillette, and that's why in my notes I happened to say I was surprised that even Ms. Gillette was in favor of the application. So you're seeing raw notes. I mean, this is not something I would normally share with anybody, but I don't have any other recourse because we don't have the tapes I could have transcribed for you. But staff presented an analysis, and in it, the bottom line is, and this is, I'm quoting from the analysis submitted by staff, not by the applicant. As you can see, the proposed RM2 SDD development is nearly identical to or less intense in terms of building size and coverage than the R6 subdivision scheme. The main difference, again, is that under R6 subdivision scheme, only 7 dwelling units would be permitted versus the 26 proposed under the special development district. And so for them and for you, the question is, okay, what difference between that unit count, what is the difference in terms of its impact on the community? And we think we've showed you that it won't be different in terms of what it looks like, and in terms of the traffic generation, and frankly, in terms of who's going to be living there. I think. When you look at what they had to say, I think it's important just to underline some of the comments. Ms. Gillette said, another way to look at this is whether the proposal is better, not just whether it fits. And she said, consider that there is a large church across the street. The highway runs through the back of this neighborhood. Shadow Lane has multifamily development. Just down the park is Walcott Village, Chatfield, and institutional use nearby. Would I like the existing house to stay and everything else to stay as it is? Yes. I would love to be able to say no, but I cannot. These 3 buildings are an improvement over the 7-home scenario. It's helpful to have seen this analysis. The space between the 7 homes is visually and sensually, I like that term, less. So, and a lot of the neighbors were then saying things like, well, you wouldn't want it in your neighborhood. And that's the bottom line. They feel that they don't want it in their neighborhood. But I want to leave you with the idea that you have to look at whether it will be okay in their neighborhood, because other developments that have had that kind of opposition have ultimately turned out to be okay in the neighborhood and good for West Hartford. So the chair, Mr. Hearn, said, so are you saying the rear yard setback actually has to be much greater in RM2? And Ms. Doro said yes. And then he went on to say, I looked at overall site context, and that means going all the way down the corridor. I looked at the POCD for guidance. This proposal is responsible and reasonable when you consider both. It fits with the surrounding area. This is what we would want per the POCD. This type of housing is needed. The demand is high. Indeed, an associate in my firm would like this, and she is having difficulty finding an apartment. So that was TP&Z. And you look to Town Plan and Zoning Commission for guidance on whether or not it makes sense from a planning perspective. So you only had a letter before that said unanimously we recommend approval. That's why they recommended approval, because they think it is the right thing for this location. Then, this is DRAC, the Design Review Advisory Committee. It too looked at it, and it spent 3 meetings going through it, making changes, requiring the developer to do upgrades, to fix this, do that, particularly with regard to landscaping and exterior materials and the quality of the development itself. And they made a strong finding after 3 review sessions with the applicant that the relationship of the proposed buildings to the site and adjoining neighborhoods is appropriate, sensitive, well buffered, of high quality, and appropriately screened, and transitions the site into the adjacent neighborhood. And specifically, their comments are up there. The relationship of the proposed buildings to the site and adjoining neighborhood is appropriate. The site design utilizes landscape elements and significant setbacks, and the architecture's residential scale and use of colors and materials creates a contextually sensitive response to this prominent corner. And that's something for you to keep in mind. The architect mentioned it to me the other day. Just having single-family homes there doesn't do as much for the corner. And they thought, and DRAC also thought it was a prominent corner. And so this is more of a statement piece and a real contribution to the streetscape than would be just single-family homes. The proposed landscaping is of high quality and quantity, a good mixture of plantings ranging from street, flowering, and evergreen trees to shrubs, perennials, and grasses has been effectively utilized to create a well-designed streetscape and appropriately planted and screened parking areas. Of particular note is the choice to preserve several existing trees along New Britain Avenue and the willingness to expand the size of the buffer open space areas along the parking lot. These elements help to appropriately transition the site into the adjacent residential neighborhood. And I would just note that those trees are not going to be saved with the single-family subdivision. That just won't work. So that's a big change in the streetscape itself between what's possible with the subdivision and this. So let's just keep moving here. This is the zoning map. One of the other big concerns with regard to whether this is appropriate for this neighborhood has to do with the character of the neighborhood. And some people said it's just being plopped. That was a term right from the transcript, in the middle of a single-family neighborhood. Well, I think it's fair to say if you look up and down New Britain Avenue, that's not the case. Even some opponents said this is a single-family neighborhood with multifamily. They conceded that there is multifamily in the neighborhood already, but they just don't want any more. Some opponents said this is single-family all together, this neighborhood, but that's just not true. You can look at this plan and see that the zoning doesn't say that, and you can look at and remember or understand what the developments are that are in these areas. So I don't think it's fair to say, or appropriate or accurate to say, that this would be out of character or be the ruin of the single-family neighborhoods on Berkshire or Shadow or the 3 lots in New Britain Avenue. This will be a new development, well-designed, and be appropriate for that corner location. Again, I point out, can I point out, Kevin?
Yes.
Why don't you point as I do it?
I'm happy to.
Okay. So you have the park right across the street. That's not single-family. You have to the left of that park, you have a special development district and an RM2, which is a multifamily zone. That's the Chatfield, now Brookdale, Chatfield-Brookdale development, and I'm going to speak to that a little bit later. You have directly across the street that the Methodist Church, which is a very large church structure, which runs down along, you can see it goes almost the whole length of the site that we are proposing. So there is residential, single-family residential right behind us, and there is single-family residential right next to us. And one of the concerns that people raised was, well, that single-family development right next to us and behind us is low. It's one-story ranches, and this would be out of context with that. But I just remind you that any single-family development that's going on those lots would also be would not be a single-story ranch. It's going to be, you're allowed to go up to 30 feet and 2.5 stories with any development, and that would be, I'm sure when Mr. Reinhardt envisioned doing this, he was planning on building houses that were sizable enough to be that height. So there are definite benefits to this development, and I'd like to quickly go through those for you. And for the members of the public, driveways. So with this development, with these 7-lot subdivision, you're going to have one driveway on New Britain Avenue, and you're going to have 5 individual driveways onto Berkshire Road. And the southerlymost driveway onto Berkshire will be only 120 feet from the intersection. Kevin, why don't you come up? Maybe we should switch to that one too. Any vehicle headed east on New Britain Avenue.
This one?
Whatever shows us that. Yeah, I guess that's fine. Any vehicle headed east on New Britain Avenue wanting to make a left turn into the combined driveway on New Britain Avenue will have to wait for a break in the westbound traffic. This would be a traffic safety concern for a possible rear-end accident for eastbound traffic. On Berkshire itself, the driveways are going to be briefly blocked by those buses because they are much closer than our driveway will be to that intersection. So the 26-unit development eliminates all of those issues. So you have one driveway set far enough back from the intersection so that going in and out can be accommodated safely. So that's a safety benefit with this over the existing subdivision approval. It's also, as Kevin, I think you mentioned, it's located at the high point of Berkshire, which gives it excellent visibility also. Building coverage, We provided you with a chart in our PowerPoint in the initial application, and that report that went in to TP&Z also underscored that the 7-lot subdivision, typical house, 2-story colonial, including a 2-car garage, is going to end up potentially with building lot coverage of 26.3%, which could be increased to 30% over time as people add to it, maybe a playhouse, maybe a storage shed, maybe a second garage, maybe a studio. All of those things can add to the building coverage in a single-family zone. This development, if you approve it, has less coverage proposed. It's at 25.4% lot coverage, and it can't be changed unless somebody comes back to you for a full application to change it. So it's protected. It doesn't change. That will be maintained as a very green site. Building height, this is capped at 27 feet. On single family, it is allowed to go 3 feet higher. Is that a big difference? I don't know, but it certainly makes this a little more acceptable, perhaps, to those who are concerned about the height of people in structures looking into their yards. Side and rear yard setbacks with the single family development, they are able to be within 4 foot of their neighboring property. So you can have a garage setback. Well, actually, that's the side yard setback between the houses, can be 4 feet. That would leave only 8 feet between the houses. And I think it's fair to say that could feel very tight. You don't have that with the multifamily development. It fits well on the site. There's a lot of air, a lot of space, a lot of green. The 26-unit development is 5.3 times greater setbacks from Berkshire Road than the R6 zone requires, and 3.7 times greater than the R6 zone requires along New Britain Avenue. I would also note that with this development, there is a fence that runs along the back and side of this development, which is not required at all for the subdivision development. So you have more control in terms of protecting neighbors by, some people talked about the fact that they didn't want, this shouldn't be approved because renters would just wander over into the yard that's behind the development. Well, frankly, without, this is a hodgepodge. People can do whatever they want. I don't have to have a fence. They can wander over to the neighbors' properties. So this is a benefit. It has more control for the abutting neighbors than does a single family. Landscaping, the subdivision plans for the approved 7-lot subdivision show approximately 1 tree to either be planted or maintained per lot. The approved plans show all other vegetation on the lots to be removed. Period. The 26-unit development proposes a very robust landscaping plan consisting of preserving 3 significant trees along New Britain Avenue, preserving several existing trees along the easterly and northerly property line, and planting 9 new street trees, 20 evergreens ranging in height from 8 feet to 12 feet, 18 understory trees, and 408 shrubs. If approved, all of this landscaping is required to be maintained and replaced if damaged. Annual inspections by the town will ensure required upkeep. Because it's a special development district, the town has control over this. Drainage, I won't go into the specifics of it. It's in our benefits analysis, but the drainage that's proposed will reduce the amount of runoff to the abutter to the east. The subdivision doesn't do that. It holds existing standards but doesn't do that. And the subdivision, while it does not increase any runoff, if there are additions and more impervious surface that's imposed on the subdivision plan over the years, that could potentially exacerbate the runoff onto other properties. With this plan, you can't change it unless you come back and go through this whole process again. So the drainage controls that are in place, they're significant, they're expensive, and they benefit the direct neighbor to the east, and they've been approved by the town, will remain active and able to accommodate all the drainage. So that's a benefit. Site lighting, there's no lighting proposed as part of the approved 7-lot subdivision, as exterior lighting choices are left to individual homeowners. Accordingly, nothing would prevent, as an example, installation of a floodlight on the rear of a house to light up the backyard. These lights could be visible from the abutting properties. They might be sensitive to their neighbor and not do it, but it could be. The 26-unit development lighting plan consists of lighting fixtures positioned to prevent light trespass onto abutting properties. In addition, the site lighting fixtures adjacent to the abutting property lines will have shields to prevent the lighting source from even being seen. So you're not that the light's not going to spill over, they're not even going to see the light source because it's going to have a shield on it on the side that's facing the neighbors. Taxes and school impact, we talked about. I don't think we have to get into it again, but there'll be a tax benefit, and there won't be children impacting the school system with multifamily. There could be more children in the school system, but I don't think 7 houses are going to tax the school system, so I really don't think that's a problem. But there will be a tax benefit with this particular development. There's another thing, repaving of Berkshire Road. When that sewer line is extended, and when those underground utilities are put in, whether it's for the subdivision or for this development, that road's going to get all torn up for the length of Berkshire Road. Under the subdivision plan, the only thing that's required is that that road be patched. Under this plan, the town asked and the developer agreed to remill and repave all that portion of Berkshire. Something the town might have done in the future, but the developer is picking up the cost of doing that. So that's another benefit for Berkshire. It's going to look nice and neat and clean when it's finished. It wouldn't if the single family, it would be patched until the town could repave it in the future. So property upkeep, I've already talked about that. Again, people are concerned that this is not owner occupied, but it's going to be owned by Mr. Calafori, and it's going to be kept up. First of all, it's going to be kept up because it has to be kept up. Second of all, because it's a special development district. You have more control over this than you do over a single family. And second of all, he's going to be renting it out. He's got to keep it marketable and keep it something that people want to move into, or he suffers as a result. So there's more control with this special development district application than there is with single family. I'm getting close to the end here.
Some of the council has questions too, so.
Okay. Why don't I go through it and then we can do the questions, okay? Difficult to make a decision with opposition. Obviously, that's tough for you. You've got to sit here and you've got to look a lot of people in the eye, and you've got to say, if you approve it, that we don't necessarily agree with your concerns, and we think ultimately you're going to like this better than you would have liked a single family, even though it doesn't seem that way right now. And that takes courage, but you've done it before. You've done a hard analysis of difficult applications in the past. Clearly, you've had to make a difficult choice with regard to the most recent one is 243 Steel Road, and people said there's too much traffic. It's not right for the area. Renters are not good. We heard a lot of very negative stuff in that proceeding about renters. The Pond House is one I remember well. Not all of you were sitting on the Pond House application. There was testimony. There were a lot of people and many nights of hearing and litigation over that. There were comments that children will be killed by traffic, events will be bad for the neighborhood, there's going to be too much noise, using a public park for private gain is a bad thing to do. We want a quiet park, we're not event space. And I'll bet there's no one now who thinks that that was the wrong decision for that particular location. Maybe there's some, but that's a great benefit to the park and to West Hartford. It's well used, community events, all kinds of things. It almost didn't happen. In fact, it was denied once, and then only through litigation was there a second vote with a few changes that it got approved. I remember one, this dates me, but back in 1980, over 30 years ago, when Mr. Ed Cape came in at 43 North Main Street. He lived at 43 North Main Street, which is sort of the first block in from the center on North Main, on the west side of North Main. And he wanted to convert the first floor of the house for his landscaping business so that he could reside upstairs. And the neighborhood went ballistic, and they came out against that application. It was the first zoning hearing I'd ever been to. We were in the town hall auditorium. We had to pack everything up. Do you remember this, Pat?
No.
You weren't here either. I'm really dating myself. We had to pack everything up and move it to the school auditorium next door. The 3 TV trucks, Channel 8, Channel 30, and something else, had to go with us. They moved all their equipment over right then and there, and we had the public hearing. So that had so many neighbors come out in opposition to it on the basis of encroachment into the residential neighborhood. And that approval led to the preservation and use of many of those homes along North Main Street, which were at the time becoming not that desirable. That's the argument we made back then, that it was not desirable. They weren't being purchased and used for single family. They had a better and higher use. And now, many of those, they all remain, and they haven't been destroyed because the town was able to adapt in the face of much opposition and come up with a solution that made sense and has been very positive for the town. Of course, there are other applications, Blueback, you've all sat through that. West Farms Mall was hotly contested. The Hebrew Home and Hospital, I remember, was strongly opposed by the surrounding neighborhood. But what I want to remind you of is one, if I can go to that zoning map again, Kevin. Basically, kitty corner across the street. Someone said that, you know, my reference to that as a multifamily development was incorrect, and I think,
This one?
Yes, this map. But that property right there, that is where Chatfield was originally approved. And that happened back in 1985. But the neighborhood came out in opposition to that. It was 130 rental units. The comments that were received back then are so similar to the ones that you're hearing now. They had to do with the developer. Why can't this be developed for the way that it's zoned? Are you telling me it's so expensive somebody can't develop it for single-family homes the way it is currently zoned? That had been the Girth Farm. And the estate, well, actually, the bank had held it for the estate for over 10 years. Nobody wanted to develop it for single family, which it was zoned for. The bank said, nobody's ever come to us for single family. They've come to us for car dealership, corporate offices, other kinds of resident. I don't know about residential, but there were a lot of development, commercial, but not for single family. They could have gotten between, I think, 40 and 50 single family homes over there. And it just, nobody was doing it. There were other applications that had been applied for other uses other than the multifamily use that was ultimately approved at that location, and the council had denied it. I think by the time of this particular application, there had been 4 denials for that. And it's always interesting to go back and see who was sitting on the council, but back then it was a very interesting council. But what people said were, let me just take some of these comments. And again, it was rental units back then, elderly rental units, 1 bedroom and 1 bedroom with dens and some singles. And they talked about, Mr. Curran led the opposition to that. He was president of the Burnham Drive Homeowners Association, founded in 1980, and he said, all of the abutting neighbors here, tonight we are joined by the residents of Astronaut Village, Ridgewood Road, in opposition of this proposal. He went through a lengthy reason why it shouldn't go forward. Some of the same comments that were raised at this hearing, it's spot zoning. Spot zoning has to stop in this area. Others said our first topic of concern is traffic. At past meetings, we've often joked that New Britain Avenue will soon become the Berlin Turnpike of the West. I'm here to tell you that as far as traffic goes, we've made it. And he talked about the traffic counts at that point. Some of the same pleas in that proceeding is made to you here. We ask you to imagine what it's like to be living nearby on a street that has that many cars. One more car is just too much for our neighborhood. look at it through our eyes. One of the things that's interesting back then is one of the biggest arguments against this was pollution. And in 30 years, that's not as much of an issue because cars have changed. So things change, is my point I want to make with regard to that. But tonight, we place this presentation in the record. They presented a major petition. I believe this required a 2/3 majority. They said that we consider it a commercial enterprise with absentee ownership. Let us state tonight that by making a statement to the residents, let us start tonight by making a statement to the residents and voters of the southwest section of the town that this council is putting the quality of life in this area ahead of expanding its tax base. We urge you to deny this application based on the fact that one additional car or one additional gallon of sewage or one additional milligram of carbon monoxide is too much for this area at this time. Let us work together to restore the confidence to the residents and voters of this area and their elected officials, their elected officials are looking out for them and for the quality of life of residents. It goes on and on and on, and many people are speaking out against it again. Many of the arguments, why do they need it? Elderly people are not going to live there. Why would they want to live there? Would you want to have your elderly family member there? It's too dense. We are also aware of the possible problems frequently associated with an absentee landlord, problems which may not occur, but in hindsight, you're going to look back and think that they might. Traffic, going on, a lot about traffic. My concern with traffic here is Chatfield Drive, very narrow, winding. It's dangerous. People crossing into the park are going to get hit. So it goes on and on and on. But the point is they are the same concerns. And you know, because you've sat through zoning hearings, that many of those concerns get raised with applications that come before this body. In hindsight, or in retrospect, I think you can look back and say that was a positive approval. It was a 6-3 vote. It was a difficult vote for the town council to make. That has proven to be a very positive development for the area. It is multifamily. It's been added to over the years. No one, just like 243 Steele, that's not true. Mr. Knight came out in opposition. And I should also say this application was appealed by the neighbors. They cared enough to take it to the courts, and the court upheld your decision. But very little opposition in the future as that was expanded, as Brookdale bought it, as Brookdale added the Alzheimer's unit and added additional housing there to expand that whole development. But they certainly couldn't have done that when they came in initially. My point is, yes, this is a difficult decision for you. But ultimately, you have to look at the hard, cold facts and decide, not emotionally, but decide whether this really does make sense. And in the end, 5 years from now, someone else is going to be before you and using Berkshire West as an example of a positive change along a roadway to benefit a neighborhood. Now, we feel very strongly that that is the case, that you would be able to do that if you approve it. So we hope you will.
Thank you, Attorney Pearson. I just want to make sure that my colleagues have an opportunity to ask the questions that they had. So, Mr. Winograd, you had a question?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had one question. I'll ask it of you, Attorney Pearson, but Attorney Allaire can jump in if he disagrees. There has been a lot of talk this renter versus owner issue and condos versus apartments. I'll ask a question. In terms of our decision making, is there any distinction between we don't use that term of renter or owner. The issue is multifamily. Would there be any difference in terms of what you're bringing to us if these were organized as condos? And beyond that, if they were organized as condos or apartments, is there anything within these restrictions that would prevent it from going sort of either way, from condo to apartment or vice versa?
The answer is no, because your zoning is based on multifamily, a number of units, density, building setbacks from side yards, height, all of that. So you can't say, just like you can't tell a homeowner they can't rent out their house. It could go either way between between rental or condominium, but zoning doesn't address whether it's ownership or not. I would welcome anything that Mr. Allaire might have with regard to that.
I assume he'll jump up if he disagrees.
No, I think that's exactly correct. The dusty old phrase that we use is that zoning regulates use, not user. And whether it's multifamily rental or multifamily owner occupied, it's the same use. It's residential units being used.
Thank you. And along those, similar lines, there's been certainly some letters, and certainly in your presentation and your written correspondence, the issue of children. Certainly there is no rule against children. You're not telling us that the owner plans to discriminate against families with children, I assume.
The owner would not plan on discriminating against families with children. But the reality is they're not going to want to move there.
And I guess I'll make comments perhaps later more appropriately.
And I should clarify that. It's probably school-age children. You may very well have somebody who goes in with a young child, but usually what happens, and you still have that evidence from those two developments that you can look at, and one of them's West Hartford. That is the case. People who rent in multifamily developments don't typically want to raise their families there. That's when they go into the neighborhood and buy those homes and settle into West Hartford and raise a family with a backyard.
I think that while I think it is important for us to talk about who would be attracted by developments and hope that we have a mix that welcomes, a broad demographic, I'd hope that the desire for a broader group coming in does not lead to any conclusion that we're discouraging children.
No.
And it concerns me when a developer comes and talks about the tax benefit versus the burden of children. I don't consider children to be a burden. To the extent that was raised either by the neighbors in opposition or by you in support, I find that distasteful. I think that having more children in West Hartford is a benefit.
Agreed.
And our schools are, in fact, what makes our community great. And any effort to create development that would discourage children would, in fact, be putting us down a really bad road. So I appreciate, again, that there is nothing in a zoning application that relies upon, in either way, on whether or not people choose to live there with children. As you know, things change over time. And whether these become more desirable for school-age children, could happen. And I certainly, and again, I just want to be on the record,
That's fine.
both from my point of view, but also
accept-
from yours, that
I agree.
this is not conditioned on not having
Not at
kids.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Anybody else? Karen, you had a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I assume Mr. Baldy's fears of his real estate value going down have been alleviated by the commitment by the potential developer to cover the gap, if that's the case. Is that true?
I can't speak for Mr. Baldy, but clearly my client is committed to doing it. I think Mr. Baldy is still signed on as a signer of the petition. Joe? Mr. Calafiore would like to address that.
Joe Calafiore. I live at 82 Sycamore Road in West Hartford. We offered that, and Mr. Baldy rejected it. He just doesn't want the project, and he wanted nothing to do with that. And I just wanted to be clear on the record for that was rejected as an option. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is that something that is typical, and a developer would make that type of promise or commitment to a homeowner?
Nothing is really typical in any one of these applications.
Okay.
I think what it evidences is real confidence on the part of the applicant that this will not be an issue for Mr. Baldy. He may feel like it will be in the future, but property value impacts have just not, it hasn't been shown that a development like this will negatively impact property value impacts. I know there was a letter Mr. Dakers submitted to you with regard to 243 Steel in response to the concerns neighbors had that rentals at that location would devalue property values, and he said there is nothing that would, I could leave a copy of that letter, but it's not germane to this particular site, but the same principles hold, that there's nothing about a multifamily development going in at that location, even if it's rental, that would lead them to devalue properties.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question, but I think it might be best directed at Mark. Is that possible to do something like that, or is that not fitting?
Mr. McGovern?
Mr. McGovern?
Oh, Mr. McGovern?
Is that possible? I'm just
I
curious
have no
if
objection.
we're aware of the mix of rental versus owner occupied in our town, and is whatever our mix is in terms of percentage, is that where a town of 63,000 residents should be, rental versus owner occupied?
For the record, Mark McGovern, Community Development Director. That'd have to be some research that we'd
Okay.
have to look into. I can't
Okay.
address that specifically for the built environment. I will say that the vast majority of the new units built over the last 5 or so years have been rentals as opposed to condominiums.
Okay. And I assume that's because it's the trend. That's what individuals want.
That's what individuals want, and that's what developers see as the most viable, quite frankly. We've had a few condominium developments, but they've been very small, under 15 units. Any application we've had for more than 25 units have been for rentals.
Okay.
It's a different development model, and a developer choice to pursue one or the other.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan.
Could I just add something to that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Chuck reminded me that that was something that in the Metro, the 243 Steel application that we looked at, and one of the points that was made in that presentation was that West Hartford had fewer multifamily rental units than any of the Farmington, Avon, Simsbury, and Glastonbury. And that indeed, it was one of the arguments that was made was if you fall behind, it could have repercussions in terms of who is going to move into your community, your ability to attract young millennials. So we have not updated that, but that was recent history, that was information that was provided to the town council.
Thank you. It is helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other? Oh, Ms. Fay.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that. So when you're counting multifamily, are you referring to specifically apartments like these, or do the multifamily homes that we have in town, are you counting those as well?
In looking at multifamily, a multifamily, again, in the way that zoning doesn't distinguish between multifamily includes both owner-occupied, like a condominium, and rental. But I think the issue we were addressing was whether West Hartford has a good number of new rental units available, or rental units available for people looking to come into the community on a rental basis.
Okay, to clarify, would a two-family home be considered a rental or a three-family?
Well, it depends. A duplex could be owned. Each person on each side of the duplex could be owned. It could be owned individually. Or one person could own one side and rent it to somebody else. Somebody could own the bottom floor and rent out the top 2 floors. So it all depends. Everything is different. Yeah.
Okay.
Or somebody might not even live in that and rent the whole thing out and be owned by somebody else.
Is your question whether we treat a two-family home as a multifamily for zoning purposes?
No, more for the
Okay.
housing stock.
Would you want to clarify? Because Chuck is going to...
I think, and again, I apologize, we don't have that number at our fingertips, obviously, but I think the point that the study that Metro Realty did was a comparison of the larger projects, not two-family homes or three-family homes, but larger,
Pure
like,
rental development.
exactly, like that we have around that you're familiar with. I hope that clarifies it.
Yeah, it does, but I was trying to draw a distinction between, sorry about that, apartment buildings per se, like these kinds of developments versus total available rental stock, which would include the 2 families, the 3 families, the 4 families, and so on.
And that would bear the same with the other communities as well.
Mhm.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Miss, are you all set? Yes. Okay, Mr. David.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Attorney Pearson, do you think that economic feasibility of a project is relevant to our consideration of a zone change? And if so, why? Repeat.
No, I'm pondering it. You always test me, Councillor Davidoff. What is relevant to you is whether the use of a particular parcel is going to be achievable. And yes, I do think that's relevant. So what we are positing with you is the information that would support the fact that single-family development of this parcel doesn't make sense because of infrastructure costs. Now, those are things that affect the planning of a community. To some extent, it's already come into play with, many kinds of developments. This town council looked at it with regard to Chatfield just across the way many years ago. If it's zoned single family and nobody's building single family, there's a reason. So that sort of challenges you to think about whether or not it's the right zone for that particular area. And I think certainly that's something that you can look at.
So as a follow-up, do you think that, pertaining to your testimony this evening, that a single-family 7-lot subdivision is economically not feasible during these current market conditions?
I'm not qualified to say that. I'm just a lowly attorney, so I'm not qualified to say if it isn't. What I've given you is information that you can use or not use at your discretion, which would indicate that it hasn't been developed, someone else walked away from it. Maybe somebody else can work magic and make it happen, but we don't have information that we would give you that would make us think it is a reasonable use given the infrastructure costs. And the biggest issue that's come to light, which maybe wasn't appreciated initially, is the extension of that sewer line to serve those houses. Now, could you develop it into 2 lots and have them all served from New Britain and just from New Britain Avenue? Yes, you could do that. And would somebody want to buy the property and develop it for 2 single-family homes off of New Britain Avenue where you wouldn't have to extend the sewer off of Berkshire? That's certainly possible. No one's come forward to do it, and that's all I can say is that there's no evidence that somebody really wants to do that. And I would think you could reasonably look at the situation and assume that that is not where people are going to build single family in West Hartford. Not new single family.
Are you familiar with the site at the corner of Albany Avenue and North Steele where a older home was
Yes.
torn down?
Yes, I just heard about that.
And one newer home has already been constructed,
Mhm.
and the other is under contract to be constructed?
Mhm.
Do you see any similarities to that parcel of land to this current project?
No, I mean, I don't think it's a relevant consideration.
Well,
Did somebody propose multifamily there?
The reason I ask is I think that sort of epitomizes economic feasibility of getting a rate of return on the lot and on the sale of the home.
May I suggest that there might be a little bit different market at that location that there would be on New Britain Avenue?
Well, I beg to differ because if one looked at the close proximity of those 2 homes, one could argue you couldn't live any closer to somebody than where stood one house now stands 2. And there is a value to having open space and space between an abutter. So with that, we'll just leave that if you didn't see a connection there.
What I do know is that I think there's another development that's been recently approved that would have involved taking down a home that was a single-family home, and I think that is under construction on the corner of Farmington and Arlington. And there's a multifamily development, as of right, that goes down Arlington Road into that neighborhood. That's a much more similar situation than this is. So that's what I would say, and that's I don't know how many units there are, but that's a more similar situation than the one you were raising.
All right, well, thank you.
Oh, 8. I was just told, because Mr. Solly probably worked on it. Yes. He did. 8 units in that multifamily development.
Right. I do think, though, that it abuts other apartment buildings that are right next to it, though. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Avila. Anybody else? Okay, with that, I think if you want to, Mr. Allaire.
I just wanted to note, during her presentation, Attorney Pearson mentioned the subdivision application on this site. Just for purposes of the record, as you know, but members of the public may not, the Plan and Zoning Commission approved subdivisions, not the Town Council. That was approved, I believe, on August 1st of 2016. And I checked with Mr. Dumais, and the vote was 4-0, in favor. But the thing to remember is that subdivision applications essentially must be approved if they meet the regs. So an application that is submitted and meets the regs, there is little discretion there as opposed to your action tonight. So it's a very different standard of review. The other thing is that Mr. Soley presented his updated report this evening. Mr. Dumais provided a copy of it to Dwayne Martin, our town engineer, who has emailed his response to that report, because we're nothing if not agile in this organization. And I'm passing out copies to you. It's one paragraph, so maybe I should just read it into the record. It says, Todd, I reviewed the supplemental traffic analyses and do not have any concerns with the additional traffic during the school dismissal time of day. There will be minimal traffic generated by the proposed development during all times, but very little during the school dismissal. The existing traffic queue during the school dismissal time creates backups for a short period of time during weekdays. If anything, existing motorists from the proposed development may need to turn right out of the site to avoid the queue if it reaches the site driveway, which may happen from time to time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Allaire.
Could I just say one other thing?
Yes.
Well, 2 things. I didn't have a chance to thank you for your consideration on this matter, and for all of the audience members for being patient. I know this is, matters a lot to them. But I also, I told you that Counselor Davidoff always throws me something I'm not quite ready for. I'm not sure whether what you were asking, and if you were indeed asking this, I want to make sure I've answered it appropriately. If your question is it a consideration for the council or for anybody else whether or not or how much a developer might make on an application, the financial benefits to a developer, I would say that is definitely not something that's on the table. So I'd like to put that on the record, if that's what you were asking. I'm not sure. Thank you. So again, thank you very much. Appreciate all your time on this.
Thank you, Ms. Pearson. And with that, we will close the public hearing. We'll take a probably 10-minute break in reality, and then come back to resume our council meeting. Thank you.
Going home? Good plan. Yeah. No, I'm good. I'm good. We're done.
Mr. Dixon, what's going on?
So, thank you.
Yeah, they messed with the volume levels. See, Tom, that's what it was. That's what it was. It's the level.
No, it's it actually sounded
This
really
one,
low.
the podium.
It sounded really low.
The podium I can get up.
You could hear it. I couldn't hear that, but it could hear Yeah, no, I could hear the whole thing. He was right next to me.
TikTok. I at least need, whether, it's great, when you click on it, where do you go? He's doing a 3-year-old. Oh, okay. So, he wants more time. He wants more time. Let's see.
Test, test, test.
Can you hear it anywhere else?
Test, test, test.
You should be able to hear off someone else's.
Test, test, test.
You can?
Okay. We're missing, oh, sorry. Okay, we will call the 7:30 council meeting to order. Start with Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'm going to start by making a motion to suspend the rules to present a proclamation. It's really an informative proclamation. Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. We didn't do roll call. We could do roll call first. Want to do roll call? Thank you.
Mr. Barnes?
Present.
Ms. Cantor?
Here.
Mr. Davidoff?
Here.
Mr. Dodge?
Here.
Ms. Fay?
Here.
Ms. Kerrigan?
Here.
Mr. Sweeney?
Here.
Mr. Winograd?
Here.
Mr. Williams?
Here.
Thank you. So all those in favor, the rules, yes? I'll say yea.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, motion carries. Whereas the health and vitality of a community is reflected in the participation of its citizens in those activities that further the strength of the town, and whereas one of the most fundamental and sacred rights of any democracy is the right to vote, and whereas in order for our government to function effectively and respond to the needs of our people, citizens must play a role in shaping it, and whereas registering to vote empowers and encourages eligible citizens to mobilize and exercise their right to vote and have their voices heard on Election Day, and whereas it is important for voters to participate in every election, and whereas National Voter Registration Day is held on the fourth Tuesday of September and seeks to create broad awareness of voter registration opportunities to reach tens of thousands of voters who may not register otherwise, now therefore be it proclaimed that on behalf of the Town Council and the residents of West Hartford, I, Mayor Sherry G. Cantor, do hereby recognize the month of September as Voter Registration Month and declare Tuesday, September 25th, as Voter Registration Day in the town of West Hartford. Also, all of our high schools actually will have voter registration cards in them on September 25th and potentially longer than that too, as long as we have volunteers. Whoever you know that needs to register to vote should. So anyway, then we will move on. Actually, I have one more little thing, and I know it has been a long night, but this is important, and I just want to say just a few words. Yesterday, when 9/11, we remembered 9/11, and we remembered the 17th anniversary, there was a really big difference the day after. And that's today, 17 years ago, when we saw the headlines of the horror and the shock, and we remember the incredible, fear that we all felt. We think about all of those that were lost this day, and we had people in West Hartford, actually, that were lost that day. The families that were absolutely shattered. I think of the Lenahan family, who I grew up with. We remember the heroism of the first responders that raced into those burning buildings, and the firefighters that many of them are suffering today with the effects from that day. But we remember the before and we remember the after. And I saw this little poem and I just wanted to share it. This was written by 9-year-olds on September 11th, 2002. So a year after they were 8. And one of my sons was that age on 9/11. He's 25 now. Before September 11th, we would wake up with a list of don't forgets. Don't forget to wash your face. Don't forget to brush your teeth. Don't forget to do your homework. Don't forget to wear your jacket. Don't forget to clean your room. Don't forget to take a bath. After September 11th, wake up with a list of remembers. Remember to greet the sun each morning. Remember to enjoy every meal. Remember to thank your parents for their hard work. Remember to honor those who keep you safe. Remember to value each person you meet. Remember to respect others' beliefs. We remember. So I just thought I would leave you with that. And then we will go to number 4.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move approval of the minutes of the Town Council meeting 8/14/2018 and the public hearing establishing procedures for licensing and public safety police details at entertainment establishment 8/14/2018.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. We have the public forum section of the town council meeting. That is something that is not the subject of a public hearing. If the sign up is blank, but if there's anybody that would like to speak to anything else on the agenda of the, okay, we will move on to number 6, Ms. Kerrigan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move we place items 8, 10, 11, and items 20 through 23 on the consent calendar.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Number 7, Ms. Kerrigan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move approval of an application by 47 Pratt Street LLC, owner 1340 and 1344 New Britain Ave, and 8-16 Berkshire Road, requesting a change of the underlying zone for 1.7 acres at the northeast corner of the intersection of New Britain Ave and Berkshire Road from R6, one-family resident, to RM2, multi-family resident district, and special development district designation for proposed 26-unit multifamily development in 3 buildings to be known as Berkshire West.
We have a second?
Second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded, but before we vote, I'm sure there will be a couple of comments. Would anybody like to start on the comments? Mr. Barnes? And it's going to be roll call.
Yeah, roll call vote. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? No?
It's not great.
No?
Maybe try. Oh, just.
Is there a volume on this thing? Does that work better? No. All right. So I'll just turn it up a notch, add a little volume. Try, I'll keep it there.
It's still working a little.
You want stereo?
No. So this is our second night. In addition, we've received a lot of correspondence, a lot of information. I think I have about 10 pages of notes in front of me. First, I'd like to thank the applicant and your team for the time, effort, and money that you've invested into this application and into this proposal. And also thank the residents for coming out on 2 different occasions, sending your emails to the town and to the councilors voicing your opinions as well. During my, I guess 5 years now on the council, I've tried to follow the rules and follow the law. So, if there were rules that applied, that if we wanted to change them, that we should change the rules as opposed to, making exceptions. And there were a couple instances. One was with a setback for the sale of alcohol near a park. Certainly it comes into play with, zoning applications or with the MDC and things that they've proposed in the past that I've opposed because I didn't think they were consistent with their rights or, what they were permitted to do under the law. And so there was a quote by one of the residents that resonated with me, and I remember because I was sitting right next to him when he said it. It was our former town manager, Ron Van Winkle, who said, "Zoning laws protect residents, and the residents rely on zoning." Right? So when you purchase your property, you look around and you see what the zoning is, and you rely on that. And there are certain circumstances where if certain criteria are met, that could be changed. But for the most part, you rely on the zoning. And so there were a number of instances tonight. One was with respect to our former colleague, Mr. Dorr, and his single-family home adjacent to, I believe, what was a church, and now it's I believe it's multifamily or apartment. And at the time, I believe, Mr. Dorr purchased his home, that parcel that faced Farmington Avenue was either zoned for multifamily use or some other use, but it wasn't a residential use. And so when he purchased that property, if at the time he was abutting a church, he knew that he was abutting a church and that at some point in the future that could change, but he knew it wasn't going to be a single-family home. And with respect to the Steel Road property, while there were hundreds of people that voiced opposition to that project, that was, as I recall, a special development district already because it was part of that St. Mary's property. And there was already a big brick building that was there, and I believe the nuns used it as their residence for a very long time. And so we weren't asked to change from residential to multifamily or to an SDD. It was already an SDD, and I think what we were doing is we were actually carving that out into its own special development district for purposes of that project. And then finally, there was mention at the end of the comments about Arlington Road and Farmington Avenue, where I believe those apartments are going in. And I say I believe because I don't know, because it didn't come before us. It was an as-of-right project. It was already zoned for that purpose, and the folks that abutted that development or live in that neighborhood, at the time they purchased their homes, would know that that was a possibility because it was already zoned for multifamily use. So it wasn't a surprise, and it wasn't anything we did to allow that change to take place. And so now, as I look at the application before us and think about the criteria that we apply, I am not convinced that this proposal, this change from residential R6 to multifamily RM2, is in harmony with this residential neighborhood. And I understand that to the north and to the east and to the north, or I guess the northwest, for the most part, it is all residential. Now there's a church opposite on one side, and there's some other things in other parts of that area, but in that neighborhood it is zoned single family. And at the same time, I strongly believe that the homeowners, the single family homeowners in this neighborhood, that their reliance when they purchase their homes should be honored and recognized. And as I said, to the extent that we have the ability to change that I'm not convinced that that is consistent with or in harmony with what our role is as counselors. So with that, I will be voting no on the application.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Okay, Ms. Fay.
Thank you very much, Mayor Cantor. There's two responsibilities that we face tonight with this decision that I take extremely seriously. One is my role as a town councilor is to listen to residents and hear what they're saying and take their concerns for their neighborhoods very seriously. So it's not what I think necessarily, but it's what the residents think. I'm in my role to represent residents and businesses. Secondly, in terms of zoning, I think it's a very serious decision. I think it's a very important one, and it impacts the people who live in the neighborhood already, as well as those in close proximity. So I think that's a very serious decision to make, and not one that should be, made casually, or you should be, convinced or arm twisted into doing something because you want the revenue from the property. So having said all that, I think a couple points were referenced that I'd like to comment on, if I may. This has nothing to do, by the way, with renters versus residents. So that didn't factor into this decision. It was more what conforms with the property, what conforms with the neighborhood, what kind of disruption would be incurred by traffic. I know we have the studies, but I'm down there in that area quite often. I'm not in the Conner district, but my daughter plays a lot of sports over there, and traffic is an issue. So I can only imagine what it's like when the church is in session and adding 26, units in a very concentrated area would be problematic. So a couple points. They mentioned Chatfield as a competing property. I personally don't see it that way. It's very hidden from the neighbors. It's set back quite a way. It's a very different population. People probably aren't driving as much or as active as they would be with this development. So I kind of see them as two different things. The second thing that was mentioned was the tannery in Glastonbury. That's a community that I'm extremely familiar with. My two sisters live there. I probably spend 4 or 5 days a week there. My doctors are there, my hairdresser's there, et cetera. So I'm in Glastonbury quite often. And I'm very familiar with New London Turnpike, where it's located, and Flanagan Road, which abuts it. And that's not residential. That's not residential at all. New London Turnpike is a business route. It's got office parks. It's off of Route 2. And Flanagan Brothers was a former industrial site that now has mill apartments. So to compare the tannery with something like this, it doesn't abut residential property. So I really don't see similarities in that regard at all. So the other thing about Glastonbury is the housing requires 1 acre zoning. So it's not as dense as where you folks live, and adding, an apartment, even if there was residentials nearby, probably wouldn't have the impact that this does. So I wasn't really swayed by the argument of the tannery being a comparable property. So, I think, no offense to the developer, I liked the plan. I thought the building was very attractive. I think it would fit beautifully someplace else, quite frankly. But I don't think that we should assume that a zoning change in a residential neighborhood is a slam dunk. So for those reasons, I will be voting no.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll be brief. My colleagues have done a good job with summation. I do want to thank the developer, Mr. Califorri, for bringing forth the application. I think that oftentimes when you have contentious applications, it's kind of hard for the council, because on the one hand you want to encourage development, you appreciate developers, but you also want to respect the wishes of residents as well. And so I think some of the most compelling testimony that I heard throughout this hearing was the fact that people purchased homes in reliance on the zoning as it currently stood, and was recently changed to single family. And I think that's important. One of the important features we have in our zoning that is constantly emphasized, we didn't talk about too much during this hearing, but is transitions. If you look at a map of this neighborhood, I think it transitions well from single family residents to more commercial areas over where Chatham is, and then over into Corbin's Corner. And I think that this is sort of would be an infringement upon the residential neighborhood as it stands. So, like my colleagues, I will be voting no. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. All right, anyone over here? Mr. Winograd, you want to go?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I appreciate the comments made by my colleagues so far, and it's hard to disagree with the broader points. I think they've identified the best argument in terms of for rejection, which is the issue of reliance upon the zoning. That you look at an application and you see, if you move into a place, and you see single-family zoning. But I do want to talk, again, the other side of that as well, which is the balance, which is also looking for what is best both for the particular location, as well as the social benefit to our entire town. We're not elected by district, we're represented town-wide. And while there's absolutely no question that people who live closest to a development, of any proposed development, have a bigger stake in what happens, we also can't ignore, again, sort of the wishes of a broader community that, again, it looks towards that greater good for the whole neighborhood, for the whole town, and frankly, depending how you define neighborhood, for our whole neighborhood. And so we look at what is the benefit to the town of having more multifamily units? And there are benefits. There are benefits in terms of, we've talked about the attraction of millennials and empty nesters and people with children. That is one benefit. We look at the market. We talk about employment. West Hartford is the jobs magnet for our entire region. The economy of this part of Connecticut is reliant on us being a strong town. that includes us having a good mix. We're not going to be a bedroom community. Certainly we're not now, but we're certainly going to be a community, already are, that has a mix, and that is beneficial, again, not just to one particular neighborhood or not, but to the whole, in terms of attracting the best businesses and jobs to the area. And I do think a development like this has that attractive value. I noted in my questioning an area that I did not think was relevant in terms of the children and having them or avoiding them for a unit. There were other relevant things that came up too. Both sides made comments about what the prior landowner would have wanted for the site. Certainly, I think that's irrelevant either way. Certainly, an owner wanted to, put a property in trust. There are other options, but we can't let a property be determined, forever based on one owner's views, even one that apparently is as much as an institution as the owner was. The other issue, and again, Ms. Fay touched upon the renter issue, and this did, in looking through everybody's comments, it did bother me, and I'll admit to taking a little bit of it personally. I happen to live on a street that has lots of renters. My street is mixed. I have two-family and three-family units on my block. We have houses that are rented, that are single-family homes but are rented, and they're great neighbors. I like my neighborhood. I'm 8 doors or so from Farmington Avenue, and certainly Farmington Avenue is a street of multifamily units. There are some exceptions, but generally that part of town has lots of multifamily apartments and condos and apartments for rent, and that is part of the vitality of that area. The New Britain Avenue area is getting more and more vital. The businesses are growing. The restaurants, Elmwood is becoming a restaurant district to compete in many ways with the center, and has free parking. There's an attraction to New Britain Avenue and Elmwood that I think would be enhanced by this project. So again, appreciating that very important issue of reliance, but looking at the balance of things, again, I've been very mixed on this. One other issue, and I do want to end quickly, the issue of transition. I think that was a great point, that we try in our zone to have that transitional thing. I do see this project as being transitional. It is not plucked in the middle of single-family homes. It is on the edge of the neighborhood. It is across from the church. It's kitty corner from Chatfield. I will note one of the worst things that was said in public hearing was that Chatfield was assisted living. My mother lives there. It is independent living. They do have a new member unit, but the people who live there actually will push back on that. They're independent living, and I'll say it a few more times because that's really important. One of the to conclude, I do believe that there is a higher burden to change the zoning, and I guess the piece that really got me there on this project is the picture of the 7 single-family homes that were approved previously. I look at that plot and I see something much worse for the neighborhood. And frankly, for our town, I see why there might be issues of viability. The driveways, so many driveways sticking out onto 2 streets that don't need that extra traffic. I look at that and it pulled me over to see that this zoning change is appropriate. A difficult call. We did listen. I certainly listened to all the comments. I've read everything. I think it is a close call. But on the merits, I will be voting yes on this application. And again, but I do thank, however we get as an outcome here, I do thank everybody for their participation and the applicant and the residents for really giving us a good debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Mr. Davidoff?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Calafiore, Attorney Pearson, and your team for the application that you've submitted for the zone change and for the special development district. I've sat on maybe 100 or more zoning applications, either as a member of the TPZ or a member of the council. And each one I look at separately. And I basically use the same criteria as to whether or not it meets some criteria. And in this case, there's subjective criteria. There's not objective criteria as to what the application has to have. And in this particular case, as I asked at the last hearing, I asked, is it in harmony with the existing neighborhood? And in the applicant's own material, on page 23, they show what the neighborhood homes look like, and there's a mixture of these homes. And they show Berkshire Road, east and west side, Shadow Lane, north side of the street, New Britain Avenue, and they're all single-family homes. So what would I expect to find to be in harmony with the applicant's own submission? Single-family homes. The other criteria that I asked is, are there any better alternatives? And what would be better, the applicant argued during the presentation, would be this multifamily 3-building apartment complex. And Attorney Pearson tried her best this evening to explain what you would find in this apartment complex that you would not find in a single-family home. She mentioned floodlights, fences, a variety of other things. There was several things that she was going through. And I've thought long and hard about this. And we go back to that main principle. And the principle is zoning gives people a sense of certainty. And the abutter to this project, I think Mr. Baldy, just recently purchased his home, had the expectation that there were going to be homes like his located right next to his home. And even if he had done due diligence, he would have seen that there was an approved 7 single-family subdivision of single homes there. Nowhere would he have known that there was a multifamily proposal there. And that's always been one of our biggest criticisms is you got to have some certainty, because your home is probably your largest investment for most people in this community. And it may come as a surprise, but I'm not going to be supporting this application this evening. I have a few other things, and we didn't even get to them. So I don't need to talk about the proposal with respect to the buildings, but there wasn't a perfect proposal, because remember, there were some waivers that needed to be discussed, but we never even got that far into discussion with respect to the parking spaces, the waiver, the distance between the buildings, the setback waiver, where were guests going to park. So I take pretty copious notes when I listen to these things, and don't know if I like the sign that was proposed for the new entryway, but we never really got into those discussions because we were so wrapped up in whether or not we were going to make the first hurdle being the zone change. And I asked this evening Attorney Pearson the question about whether or not economic feasibility is relevant in our consideration. And for me, economic feasibility really is not relevant. There was some information prepared by the applicant with respect to the tax implication that the apartment buildings would generate compared to single-family home. It was noted that $118,000 a year would be generated in taxes to the town of West Hartford if it was a multifamily project, compared to $84,000 if they were single-family. So 16 and 18 is $34,000 difference. In my opinion, $34,000 is significant, but it's not enough to sway me. And if you look at my record, I don't think how much revenue the town's going to get based on a project is what I'm all about. I'm really about maintaining expectation with respect to the zoning laws, And as my counselor, Mr. Winograd, said, the burden is high. And for me, that standard is high. And I don't reach my decisions arbitrarily or capriciously. I try to reason them through. And I don't think the applicant met that burden, convincing me that it is in harmony or there are not better alternatives this evening. And I just want to also make a little note, having sat, I think, for almost 7 years on the TPZ, about the referral process. When I sat there, and I don't know if it has changed, but we were described as to what the proposal was. We didn't really see a lot of diagrams or pictures or things of that nature. And there was not a presentation by the applicant as to what one can expect. And you make a referral based on what you're informed by staff and by asking questions that are relevant. So in this case, I don't feel like I'm doing a disservice to our Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm cognizant that they play a very important role in our zoning approval process. But when I put everything on balance, I'm sorry to say this evening, I just can't reach over and vote in favor of it. And I voted for many projects over the years, and I've been a one-person no vote sometimes and whatever. But it just doesn't add up for me this evening. And the other thing that, and I think it's important to get in the record, I didn't respond to anybody who sent me an email over the last few days. Once a hearing process is in place, I don't talk to anyone about the current application. I think that's inappropriate. I will read your email. I will take it under consideration. I don't mean to be rude or neglectful of not considering your points. I do take them into consideration, but I don't want to ever give the appearance that that I'm just one way or the other. I just wait till we get to all the evidence into the record to make the decision. So if people were wondering why they didn't hear from me, that's exactly why. I visited the site 3 times since we first got this application. And on all 3 times, I came to the same conclusion that single-family homes are probably the best use of this parcel at this time. So, Madam Mayor and colleagues, for all those reasons, I'll be voting no on this application.
Thank you, Mr. Davidoff. Ms. Kerrigan? Mr. Dodge?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I'll be frank, this is probably one of the more difficult votes that I've taken on the council, and a lot of that is because of how personal this is. This is one of the few issues where I've really been, a lot of the people who have reached out to us, who have spoken publicly on this, are lifelong friends of mine, people who I respect and people whose friendship means a lot to me, and is one of the great joys of living in this town. The other difficult part of this is, as folks have alluded to, is the subjective element to this. I wish that there was a more objective criteria that we could look at and check boxes to determine whether this was appropriate or not, but it is sort of in the eye of the beholder and a subjective determination that we need to make. And I agree that the first question is whether the development is in harmony with the neighborhood. And I'm going to disagree with my colleague, Mr. Davidoff, here a little bit, because he pointed to, I can't remember where in the exhibits, but photos of some of the other homes that are in the neighborhood there, and to point out that it's, only single-family residential that's there. And I think part of that is, it depends on what your definition of the surrounding neighborhood is and where you draw that boundary. Because, like Mr. Davidoff, I've visited the site a few times because I think it's important to experience firsthand what we're looking at developing. It's funny how sometimes you look at neighborhoods in this town where you think you know them like the back of your hand. I can't tell you how many times I've run by there going to football practice late in the fall when we had to hold it at Wolcott Park, or going to the mall. But then when you really drive around and start looking, you can learn a lot more. And I didn't even realize that there was a multifamily development already there just down the road on Shadow Lane. And if you look at the broader area of New Britain Avenue, right across the street, there's the Wolcott apartments as well. And so, again, to say that, there's only, I'm sorry? But nonetheless, multifamily. And I think that is an important distinction, because I think, what we've heard from some folks here is, if this was condos, it might be different. If this was owner occupied, it would be different, even if it was still multifamily. And I simply disagree with those concerns. I think that a lot of the worry, a lot of the concerns about having renters in a neighborhood are simply unfounded. And so that's not something that I took into consideration. I think that there's a lot of owners who own properties who don't maintain them well. Just like there are renters. One of the benefits here, I think, is that this would be it would be multiple tenants. The property itself would be managed by one professional entity. And I think that there's a major benefit to that. And so getting back to the harmony issue, when I look at it, when I look at the plans that we saw, again, I do think that it's in harmony. After our last meeting, I think I had to look at the plans again, because in my mind I had that it was going to be like a 3-story monstrosity or something, that was built there. And I didn't realize there was actually only 2 stories. And not only is it 2 stories, but as Attorney Pearson pointed out, it actually is required to be shorter than what would be allowed by right for single-family residential. I think that the plans that were presented to us were attractive. I think that they frankly appear residential in neighborhood. And so when you look at the broader neighborhood, not just the immediately abutting street, I do think that it's in harmony with the neighborhood. And if it just came down to that, I think I'd be more on the fence on this issue. But there were 2 issues that really made my final determination for me tonight. And the first one is safety. I know that if we don't approve this, there's no guarantee that that subdivision will be built, although it is already approved. And whether it's economically feasible or not was brought up tonight. But there's a good chance that it might be built. And frankly, I think that is the less safe option here. When you look at that intersection, and one thing that I keep thinking about is we had, when I was a junior in high school, we had 2 girls who were almost killed at that intersection when they were leaving Conard. And I frankly believe that having 5 to 6 driveways coming out where people would be backing out onto Berkshire Road, or even worse, backing out onto New Britain Avenue, is far less preferable to having one driveway where people are pulling out forwards onto Berkshire, which is the less busy street. And so to me, that is a major consideration in looking at this, that given the possible alternatives, and again, there's no guarantee what those alternatives are, I do believe that this is the safer option. The second reason, the second thing that really sort of put me over the edge, not over the edge is the wrong way to say it, but that swayed me on this is control. Again, as Attorney Pearson pointed out, you could have 7 individual residential lots where those residential lots, there'd be no guarantees in terms of light pollution, there'd be no fencing. There's frankly a lot less control. And when we look at an SDD, particularly one that is as well thought out as this, I think that is far preferable given the amount of control that the town would have, given the screening that would be put up here, the fencing that would be put up, the light pollution controls, I think are significant and I think are important. And finally, I agree with Councilman Winograd. Encouraging additional multifamily housing is something that this town should be doing. I think that the town has changed a lot, even from when I was a kid, when people were looking for single-family residential neighborhoods. I know that my wife and I, 6 years ago when we moved back to West Hartford, one of the difficulties that we encountered was we wanted to rent it first, and it was tough to find a rental property that we were completely satisfied with. And I think that is what millennials are looking for. I think and I think it's not just millennials. I think it's what a lot of empty nesters are looking for. And I think that it is a societal change and is one that West Hartford is going to need to choose to either embrace or get left behind on. And so, I think that we perhaps need to take a broader look at our POCD and look at whether that's something that we should be making some different policy decisions from. But again, this was a difficult issue. It was very personal. But for the reasons that I just discussed, I'll be voting in favor of the project.
Thank you, Mr. Dodge. Mr. Sweeney?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Like Councilman Dodge, this was a very difficult decision, but that's what we're here for. So I think the main thing that I come through with this proposal is when I look at these things, I try to think about fairness. And I think that, as Councilman Davidoff spoke to, when folks bought property in that area, it was zoned as residential. And that's the expectation that I think that as a town that we need. We create the rules, right? We could change the zoning laws if we wanted to. However, we did not do that. And so what we're asked today is to make an exception based on some criteria. And for me, I think that I'm definitely in favor of looking at our zoning as a town, because I think that, as many of my colleagues have said, we need to really be serious about looking at how we provide housing here in the town in a different manner than we did many, many years ago. But that being said, folks have made investments in their houses, and I think that we need to honor that commitment that we made in regards to policy. And so, because of that, I'm going to be voting no today. But I would also like to say a few things. Throughout this process, I received some of the most ridiculous emails from folks, and some of the language that was used during this process is not something that I really want to ever see again in this town, because it had a lot of undertones that I did not really appreciate. And for me, as a young person growing up in this town, I connect those with a lot of other things that are going on, and it was really difficult for me to deal with that. And listening to that conversation, not something is productive for the town. But with that being said, I also would like to thank the applicant for his belief in this town, his continued effort to move forward on this. And I also, while a few of my other colleagues believe that this is the proposal before us is the better one, I think the one that has been, that has also been approved is something that would be in harmony with the community. So with that, I would look forward to seeing that before us. But right now, I'm going to have to vote no. Thank you very much, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Ms. Kerrigan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I didn't have the privilege of sitting here when 400 residents on Steel Road came to protest a development that they have since come to embrace. But I was here when one resident came to speak up against an additional building for that development. And so neighbors like yourself, concerned, who love their neighbors, who love their neighborhood, who don't want it to deteriorate. I live on Arnoldale Road. Go up 10 houses to the right, and there's a building. It's called the Packard. It's about 100 years old, 74 units, 4 stories high. That's my neighborhood. Single-family houses all the way down to 10 houses to the left, and you have multi-family houses. Out of that Packard, my sons have made friends. Attorney Pearson says that there would not be children there, but who knows who chooses to live where. I think we have a problem with harmony. Harmony, is it structural harmony? Is if I have vinyl siding, my neighbor needs to have vinyl siding? Or is it harmony based on how we feel about our neighbors? And I feel my neighbors at the Packard, 74 units, 4 stories high, are my neighbors. And my neighbors to the left that are in the multifamily houses are my neighbors as well. So I think we need to redefine what we call a neighborhood. And I think what's happening is, and rightfully so, because we love our neighbors, we love what we have, we don't want anything to change, ever. If we got a good thing, we want to keep a good thing. We need to look at how we define neighbors. Where I live, there was a time where the Redemption Center was going to be changed to a car wash, and the outrage in the neighborhood was crazy. When I'm vacuuming out my car, the same individuals, my neighbors that protested this car wash, are there happily cleaning out their car. Companions for Living, up over by Bishop's Corner, individuals concerned about that lot of land, the traffic, all of this. You drive by that, that is the most beautiful building around. I think our role here, and I'm not an attorney, as so many of my peers are, is to look at the town overall and look at where you need to make exceptions. And when I drove through that neighborhood, and following the suggestions of TPZ and DRAC, what I saw is an opportunity for more individuals to come into your neighborhood and make friends. The building would be beautiful. So I'm hoping, going forward, I'm supporting this development. If Liz Gillette supports it, for the most part, it's usually a good thing. She's a tough cookie. But I think fear is a horrible thing. It keeps us stuck in one place. Sometimes when you take a risk, it's a good thing. So I would be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. So I guess I'm last, and you know how the vote count already went. But this is really hard. It's hard to it's hard to have a zoning issue and not, like Mr. Davidoff said, we didn't really get into the application as much as we talked about the zoning issue because it's so fundamental. And I feel as though that is a responsibility of the town to do the zoning issues as opposed to the applicant to bring that to us. I'm not sure single family is going to work in that parcel. It has been a single family for a long time, but it's been uninhabited for a long time. And I'm not sure it's going to work. So is it better that it, that it sit fallow? I don't know. But I do think that I heard some of my colleagues say, well, we're going from the residential neighborhood to this, or it doesn't transit. This is residential. This is where people live. These are their homes. I actually started at Kane Street. That's where was my first apartment with my husband after we got married. And we bought, every penny we had, a two-family in West Hartford. And that's what kept me in West Hartford. We rented out the top floor to a woman and her mother. They were Peruvian. She happened to be a seamstress, and I visited her almost weekly because I have to have everything hemmed. And she made me meals when I was pregnant with my son, and then helped take care of my baby. These are people I lived with. This was part of my extended family, my neighbors, and I lived on a two-family street. I had two children on a two-family street, and we played, and we were neighbors. We are friends still. So I struggle with the zone change being a different use. It is a change in use, but it's a multifamily residential use that is really important in our world today. Housing trends have changed. Rental units are on the rise, whether we believe in it or not, and it's not something for us. I pulled up some statistics. So the 25 to 34-year-olds, 50% of them were homeowners in 2005. In 2015, that is 35%. So there are people that are looking for this opportunity to rent and make it their home. Whether they rent or own, it is their home. They're not moving out. I have a friend who moved to Steel Road from Granby, and she lives on Steel because she wanted a more vibrant community than her sold her home and rents on 243 Steel Road. as does one of my, an attorney that my son is friendly with, that lives in that and hopes to buy a home in West Hartford sometime in the near future. So the impression, I think, that rentals are different kinds of people or different, or don't feel as though it's their home, I think that's not what I've experienced. That's not the way my 4 millennial sons have experienced their lives, who every single one of them rent. I think they believe it's their neighborhood. They protect it and watch out for it. I think more people that live in a neighborhood feel protective and part of that neighborhood. I think it gives age diversity, and people that are new starting out and don't have the opportunity to save for a home. A lot of young millennials are straddled with student debt and cannot buy homes until later. And I also think for empty nesters, it gives them a vibrant place to be. This is a very special neighborhood. We really did feel it with you, and I do want to thank you. Some of the emails, I also thought the tone could have been different. But I want to thank you for listening tonight with incredible civility, for caring for each other. You have a great neighborhood. We've all visited multiple times. I actually ran there several times during this process. But I will say how important it is from my perspective to make sure that our town stays modern, vibrant, and vital. Employers are looking for places to be where their employees can find homes, and they're not going to go to places where either home stock is aging, or it's because a lot of millennials want updated things because that's what they've had from college. They have granite counters. It's crazy, but they do. So again, a variety of housing choices are essential for an updated job market, and you live in one of the best strategic areas in the town. You are near a highway, but you have an incredibly beautiful residential area across from one of the prettiest parks that we have, and you are walking distance, a stone's throw away from the most upscale shopping in the greater Hartford region, and probably within an hour and a half around. You live in a gem of an area. I thought it was okay that, we expand that for more people to live in that area. But it again, does not look like it will pass. I support it. I support this. So I guess that's it, and we will go to a roll call vote.
Mr. Barnes?
No.
Ms. Cantor?
Yes.
Mr. Davidoff?
No.
Mr. Dodge?
Yes.
Ms. Fay?
No.
Ms. Kerrigan?
Yep.
Mr. Sweeney? Mr. Winograd?
Yes.
And Mr. Williams?
No.
Thank you, Ms. Perini. I lost my reminder sheet because I wrote my notes on it, and now I don't know what I did with them. Okay, we'll go to number 10, Ms. Kerrigan. Reminder sheet.
I move adoption of resolution to appropriate $500,000 in the fiscal year 2018-2019 budget of the capital and non-recurring expenditure fund to supplement the purchase of financial management system.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Number 12, Ms. Kerrigan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move adoption of a resolution authorizing the town manager to execute a master municipal agreement for readjustment, relocation, and a removal of utility facilities on highway projects with the State of Connecticut Department of Transportation.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. You know what, actually? We did 8, 10, and 11. We have to do number, no, we did not. We did 10. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're good.
All right.
We're good.
Okay. Do we want
13.
do you want to explain that at all, or are we just number 12? I lost track of where we were because I couldn't hear where. You just read 12. Was it seconded? I couldn't hear.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Mr. Hart, would you like to?
Thank you, Mayor. For both items 12 and 13, this is a requirement of the state in order to receive grants for these types of projects. Every municipality in the state that's receiving a grant for one of these types of projects needs to enter into this master agreement.
Stay well. Good night.
I'm sorry, did you want me to repeat any of that? This is just a requirement from the state.
required. Okay.
Okay. Any questions for the town manager? No? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Number 13, Ms. Carey.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move adoption of a resolution authorizing the town manager to execute a master municipal agreement for rights-of-way projects with the State of Connecticut Department of Transportation.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Number 14, Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Mayor. I've distributed copies of my report to the council. I'll try to work through it very quickly. First, under the category of council business, a couple of meetings I wanted to announce. The Community Planning and Physical Services Committee will meet tomorrow, 6 p.m. in room 407. That's where we were earlier tonight. The Administration and Technology Committee will hold its next meeting at 6 o'clock in advance of your regular meeting on September 25th. We'll also hold that in room 407. At that meeting, we're going to be talking about a paperless agenda management system. The Human Services Committee will hold its next meeting at 8 a.m. on the 25th. We haven't finalized the agenda just yet. So those are some key meetings I wanted to make you aware of. Moving on to staff reports, very pleased to announce that the town is receiving a community connectivity grant totaling a little over $103,000 to be used for various cycling improvement, particularly Share the Road signage. And these are all along routes that were recently identified in our adopted bicycle facilities plan. So I'd like to thank the staff for their good work on that. Work at the Park Road at I-84 interchange continues. I'm sure folks who've driven around that area, you're well aware of it. The crews will continue to work throughout the winter months. The detours and the lane closures will remain in place during that time, and we're planning to complete the project late summer of next year. Moving on, the Fire Department Efficiency and Effectiveness Study, the consulting team from Fitch and Associates had a very good series of meetings when they were in town last week. They met with a variety of stakeholders, council, the management team, members of the firefighters union. We'll keep the Public Safety Committee informed as we move through the project, and I appreciate the council's support for this initiative. I'm not going to read through all of the items on the report. You can read it through at your leisure. A couple of other things I wanted to note. The ICMA annual conference is coming up. I will be away from roughly the 20th through the 26th. I'll be attending a board meeting first and then the annual conference. It's held this year in Baltimore. I'll designate an acting town manager, and I'll provide the council with a report on the conference on my return. More than 4,000 of my peers attend this conference, and it's a great opportunity to learn best practices. And then lastly, I wanted to note on page 3, Vanderbilt Park, which we talked about at the last CPPS meeting. Roughly 40 neighbors of the park attended a community meeting that we held last week. Folks who attended the CPPS meeting will recall that Eversource has a substation in that vicinity. They are looking to do some tree clearing to improve reliability. The neighborhood had expressed some concerns. So Eversource and a couple of our key staff members, our Director of Leisure and Human Services, as well as our Director of Public Works, went out on that site, and they walked the neighborhood through it. They talked about park needs and other amenities. So certainly want to commend and thank everyone who's involved in that initiative, and think it will lead to a very positive result. And then I have attached various upcoming events and announcements for you, Mayor. That completes my report. I'm happy to take any questions that council members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Any questions for the town manager? Mr. Winograd.
Question. Human Services, is that on the 25th or the 27th? I had the 27th. I just want to...
Oh, I stand corrected. Is that the Thursday?
Yeah.
Yes, it would be the 27th. Thank you for noting that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good catch, Mr.
Thought you
Winograd.
moved it on
Anything
me.
else? All right. So I will go with announcements. Blue Up 4PF. West Hartford has proclaimed September as Pulmonary Fibrosis Awareness Month. It is a devastating lung disease causing progressive scarring in the lungs. The foundation has asked you to light up your building with blue lights to raise awareness. All participating in the Blue Light Initiative will be featured in this year's hashtag BlueUp4PF social media campaign, which reached 128,000 people on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in 2017. The Delamar Hotel has joined with other buildings and iconic structures throughout the country by lighting its fountain with blue lights on the evenings of September 24th through Thursday, September 27th. Food pantry request, very low on canned fruit, applesauce, pasta sauce, rice, peanut butter, soup, canned pasta, SpaghettiOs, and corn. Next time you go to the grocery store, please consider picking up a few of these items and drop them off at the lobby between 8:30 and 4:30 Monday through Friday. Feast on the Farm, Westmore Park will hold its Feast on the Farm Friday, September 28th, 6 to 9. The event, which has sold out each year, is the farm's largest fundraiser. Outdoor BYOB dinner includes hors d'oeuvres, a candlelit 4-course meal, and dessert prepared by Chef Doran Puka, Scott Miller, and Omar Narot of the Doro Restaurant Group. Proceeds for the event will support the park's ecology education infrastructure. Tickets are $100 per person and are available at Westmore Park and Leisure Services, Town Hall Room 128. Last call for sign up for the Park Road Parade, which is October 6th at 10:30. It's the 20th annual parade. Contact Renee McHugh. West Hartford Fire Department grill and beer sampling will be on September 15th from 5 to 9. Donations are $10, must be 21. Live music by Fat Grip. They're great, by the way. Mighty Times, the Children's March on Sunday, September 23rd from 2 to 4. Join West Hartford Friends and Neighbors to learn the story of Birmingham, Alabama, fought segregation in 1963 through nonviolent protests and served as catalyst for positive change that impacted our entire nation. Stay for the youth-led panel discussion about activism in our schools and community. Feature West Hartford students. The event is held in the auditorium at Charter Oak International Academy. All ages are welcome, especially middle and high school students. The event is organized by West Hartford Beloved Community Builders. Open house at Playhouse Theater Academy will be on September 15th from 1 to 3. It is a theater school managed by Playhouse on Park, offering recreational classes and pre-professional training for both children and adults. All programs, classes, workshops will now be held at the 224 Eco Space, which is conveniently located for anyone in Greater Hartford area or behind, or whatever. I know. Okay. Any questions? Any other announcements? No? Okay. Reports for Corporation Council. Mr. Allaire.
I have no formal report. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Allaire? All right.
Not this week.
Okay, now I need my appointment. I took everybody's. Oh, God, okay. I don't have the term. 1 second, the appointment, I'm lost. Oh my gosh. The reminders, I misplaced them now. Thank you, sorry about that.
The bottom.
Thank you. Jean, I move that we appoint Jean Martin, appointed to the Library Board for a term ending 12/31/2021.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. No report. Number 19, Ms. Carey.
Adoption of the consent calendar.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. With no petitions, no executive session, I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries.